Hello there.
I'll be honest, wasn't sure what to expect. For the audio listener, I love that, the majority of our audience is audio only, right? Probably I would say 90% to the 10% we get on YouTube. I'm loving the increasing volume of site-based gags as we sort of ramp toward the end of the season and slowly start to lose our sanity. I don't know how, I'm just going to try and describe what I'm looking at. So, Darth he's got on, I guess it's like a big, like hard hat, and that's not even a hard hat. It's like a big, old-timey sort of English, I guess, cop hat, and some kind of cloak situation. And rather than doing the natural thing, which would have been, before he shaved his beard, keeping the mustache, what Darth has done is he is wearing a very elegant fake mustache. It's extremely a good look. What I have to know, did you own this? Oh, he's got a pipe as well, dear Lord. Okay. Now I bet you just full on own a pipe. I don't doubt that that's a thing that you own. But did you purchase the outfit? Was this in your possession? I need details.
So the robe is part of my my Jedi outfit. So I have owned that for many years.
Yep.
The hat is actually, as far as I know, like original, legit from London or somewhere.
Wow.
My aunt lived there for a good bit of time, and Dad has had this up in a cabinet forever. And when we started the series, I happened to notice it, and I was like, I gotta borrow that eventually.
You're like, I have an episode that we have to do. Right? I'm gonna need that hat. Yeah. That's that's cool. It's unfortunate for your aunt that she lived in England, but I mean, there are worse things have happened to people. This is very good. I have a very good outfit for our final episode that I won't spoil here, but that one will definitely be worth dipping into the video content for, I think. I gotta be honest before we get started. I'm very excited about this week. The energy I have coming into this pod is. Oh, this is gonna be a fun one. Yeah, I won't say much more. I don't want to, muddy the waters. But let me tell you, I'm keen.
I am highly excited as well, but I worry it might be for different reasons.
I love playing this game with you. It's great. In 3, 2. Welcome back to Give Up After 3, a critical analysis of BBC Sherlock, examining each episode to understand how things went so wrong that fans invented a secret final episode to justify why the show had been bad all along. You can find show notes and sources at zeroindent.com/giveupafter3. And if you want episodes early or just to support us, you can head over to patreon.com/zeroindent. I'm DC McNeil, author and editor-in-chief at Zero Indent. And I'm joined, as always, by YouTuber Darth. How you doing, man? How you doing?
I'm wonderful.
That was a good little flourish.
Yes, I am high on life coming after watching this episode because I freaking loved it. You might tear me completely down, but this is my absolute favorite that this show has been so far. Was this episode. So
we're covering The Abominable Bride, which is, I guess, it's like the special between season 3 and 4. I was saying to you that sorry. I should do the little bit intro bit here. So it was directed by Douglas McKinnon. It was written by Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss. It originally aired January 2016. It had approximately 11.64 million UK viewers. Big content disclaimer on this one. This episode contains topics of self-harm and strong topics of suicide throughout. It was adapted kind of vaguely from sort of the Sherlock Holmes stories a bit. It really just makes references, is what's happening here. So you loved it, is what you're saying? You had a really good time? Darth,
yes,
I have to be honest, this might be the best episode of the show.
Yes, 100%. Which it's weird to think, as many times as I've watched the series, and it's never clicked with me how good this episode was. But now that I was actually sitting and watching and thinking about the dialogue and the character interactions and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, everything just felt so spot on. And like, if I had to complain about something, it was actually difficult to figure out what I complain about. It's hard to CinemaSins this episode.
I have a lot of those.
I'm sure that you...
But
yeah.
no, to your point though, like I think it's unfortunate in the sense that this episode basically proves why the premise of the actual show is bad. Like, this episode proves that they should have just done a Sherlock Holmes set in Victorian England with these actors. Because it's so much better. Like, there's so much about this that works in a way that the main show never quite can figure out.
I want to say that that's a bit disingenuous to say that the setting itself is what makes it successful, because, you know, the writing could be good or bad depending on the time period. And something about being in this time period, maybe it's if it's the same writers, the same staff, the same people reviewing and editing their drafts and everything, then maybe these writers are just, they should be writing old-timey stuff and they shouldn't be writing modern stuff.
That's what I'm saying.
Because everything just hits so much more.
Yeah.
But you can't automatically just say it should have been in this era because it would have been better, because that's not necessarily...
I'm not saying it's true of all shows. I'm saying for this show in particular, it seems to illuminate. There's a concept we'll talk about at the end. I know we're talking in broad strokes here. We'll get into the nuance. We always do, but I think for me at least, coming off the back of this, my biggest takeaway was like there was a version of this show that would have been excellent. I agree with you. It's not just the era. It's also that the entire episode is focused on solving a crime that is really interesting. And that for me, like that was the real, like I was wasn't necessarily being facetious in saying the era makes a huge difference. It does, but it's the fact that it focuses on a crime and they have to solve the crime with like detective work. They can't Google things. They can't like know stuff automatically from the internet. Like they have to physically go out and do it, and it has that kinetic energy that the original Sherlock Holmes stories did. And so for me at least, as a diehard fan of those stories, coming to this, it still feels like the show that we've been watching, but it's probably more attuned to, I guess, like the Robert Downey Jr. style, films, that those Warner Brothers films. So let's do the summary, and then we can talk through the particulars of this episode. I will reiterate again, this one does contain a lot of topics of like suicide and self-harm. A friend of mine texted me and he was like, hey, I would love to watch this episode that you guys are going to do, but it's too much for me. If that's the case, just skip this one. It is a lot. It has been a topic throughout the show. Interestingly, when we get to the end, we'll talk a little bit about maybe what all is going on there with Moffat's interests. But let's get through the summary and then we can get to the goodies, because there's so much good stuff in this episode. So in Victorian England, Holmes and Watson take on the case of Amelia Ricoletti, a bride who fires pistols at passers-by before committing suicide. Later that evening, her husband is confronted by the deceased bride and murdered by shotgun. Months later, Mycroft refers Holmes to a case of Lady Carmichael, whose husband Eustace received a threatening warning of 5 orange pips. Eustace is uncooperative and dismisses the entire thing, forcing Holmes and Watson to stake out the Carmichael estate, waiting for the ghost to attack. The ghostly bride descends on the estate, and in the commotion, Eustace is stabbed to death. The knife left in his chest has the note, "Miss me," attached to it. After insisting the case has a simple solution, Holmes meditates, seeing Moriarty. The two discuss the nature of the problem, and Moriarty takes his own life, only to stand back up. The world shakes violently, and Sherlock wakes up in the modern day on the plane from the last episode. Mycroft and Watson and Mary enter the plane to find a frustrated Holmes rambling about the unsolved Ricoletti case. Holmes explains he has hoped to solve the case, believing it would prove crucial to solving Moriarty's return. Back in Victorian England, Holmes and Watson go after Mary in the countryside, where they collectively intercept a group of the women's rights movement. Holmes deduces that they used a body double to fake Amelia's death, allowing her to kill her husband to create the persona of the ghostly bride. Already dying of consumption, Amelia then took her own life to have her body swapped in the morgue to ensure she'd be correctly identified. Holmes then concludes that Lady Carmichael is behind the death of her husband, but when the bride approaches, it is revealed to be Moriarty. Holmes then awakes in the present and goes to Amelia's grave, hoping to exhume the corpse and find the body double buried with her to confirm his theory. While digging, he hears the corpse whisper, "Do not forget about me," before awakening on the Reichenbach Falls. Moriarty taunts Holmes and the two men fight. Just as Moriarty has Holmes on the ropes, Watson appears and kicks Moriarty over the falls. He then reveals that he knows he's in a story. Holmes leaps from the falls and wakes up on the plane. Mycroft asks Watson to look after Holmes as the trio leaves. Mycroft then remains, opens Holmes's notebook, revealing the word Redbeard. Holmes concludes that, like Ricoletti, Moriarty did indeed die, but arranged others to carry out plans after his death using his persona. The episode ends with Victorian Holmes describing his visions of aeroplanes and mobile telephones to a cynical Watson before looking out onto Baker Street in the present day. God, such a good fucking episode. Such a good episode of this fucking show, Darth. Such a good episode. That ending, when we talk about it, that ending, like, it rips so fucking hard. And it pulls off this bizarre maneuver that I've heard Gaddis talk about since. And he's like, we just did this for fun, but, there's a version of this where... Anyway, we'll talk about it. Okay. Did I miss any crucial high-level plot details? I wrote that one really quickly the other day. I think that's mostly it. There's some other stuff going on with drugs and stuff that we'll get to.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest, like, overarching thing is that this is all a scenario that Sherlock is running in his mind palace, where he is trying to solve the death and apparent resurrection of Moriarty, and he's doing it by going back in time and solving this death and resurrection of this old woman that went around killing people after she had died, which is a really interesting use of the Mind Palace that I'd love to talk about later. But I adored this episode, and I'm really curious about because you avoided watching this for for a decade, however long it's been out. You avoided watching it, and now I'm guessing it's your favorite that we've seen so far.
So here's I should explain a bit. I've alluded to this before. So basically, on my Blu-ray box set of Sherlock Holmes, which is the thing that I purchased after the show finished, it doesn't have this episode on it for some reason. I couldn't work out why. Google seemed to think there was some weird rights issue in Australia with something or rather to do with the BBC. At the time, it just wasn't released. So it's really hard for me to actually get a copy of this, like, in the fallout from the show ending. And I was so burned by the final episode that I had no interest in going back to it. What's interesting about coming to this now in this mode of engagement, I've said this before, but I think this episode in particular is where the method really pays off for me, because what I was able to do when I was viewing this is not just see it as like a holiday special, which is kind of how it originally aired, but the way that I was able to kind of view this was this is the writers using all of the devices they've created so far to have a go at a very different style of telling the kinds of stories they're interested in, and a very different mode of engaging with these characters. And it let them kind of reset the play a bit and go, okay, well, without all of this context of all the stuff that's happening, what can we actually do with these personas we've created, right? Like, Anderson is functionally the same character, but he's in a different place, in a different mode. And Molly Hooper is functionally the same character, different place. All these characters still have a lot of the persona and the archetypes, but they get to play with them in such different spaces. And it's a really cool. It really is like it's a canonical way of doing like an alternate universe fan fiction for your own show. And it reminds me of the kind of thing like Dan Harmon would do in Community all the time, where he'd be like, what if all of these characters were in G.I. Joe? Or what if they were...
I was about to say, the G.I. Joe episode. Yeah. It's so good.
And it's really... I think it's really telling of the time and the era this came out that they did this. This is very much the kind of thing that people were writing on Tumblr already. People were already doing these fan fictions, being like, what if the Sherlock Holmes was back in Victorian England? Or indeed the cartoon where it was like, what if it was the son of Sherlock Holmes and it was like the 22nd century or whatever? There were already these kinds of things happening. And I think it's really curious that they found a canonical way to put fan fiction about their show in their own show. And it's somehow the best episode of the fucking program, which is baffling and interesting to me. I'm really keen to get into it. I should also explain, unlike my usual method, so I've said before, my method for this show is I'll watch the episode one time, and then I'll watch it again, pausing and taking notes. That's sort of how I've been doing it. And as I do that second watching, I do my research at the same time. So often that second watching takes me like maybe 7 hours, something like that, maybe 10 hours, something like that. This one, I watched the whole thing, then did all my research, and then watched it again. I don't have a lot of research for this one other than just the historical context and probably talking about Tumblr's response to this episode, as well as the way that it released, which was really interesting and different. Talk a little bit about that toward the kind of middle and end, but yeah, watching it this time, so because it wasn't on my DVD box set, I had you send me your copy, and then I was like, this isn't a high enough resolution for my very nice television. So I called multiple different JB Hi-Fi, which are like electronics retailers here, and they're one of the few places that still sell DVDs. And I managed to find one that was a few suburbs over. So I got in my car and I drove like to the other side of the city, and purchased a single. It was a single copy of the episode, and I took it home and I put it into my PlayStation 5 and I watched it. And I gotta be honest, that in 4K it's a really good looking episode as well. There's something they're doing stylistically here, which becomes season 4's aesthetic, which is really cool. Okay, that's enough of me blowing smoke up the arse of this episode. We should get to it. I have gripes. I have things I would have done differently. I have some really interesting thoughts about, I guess, the architecture of this episode, I suppose, and then some structural things I want to kind of pick through with you as well. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, in 1881, Dr. John Watson, an army medic, has returned to London after being wounded during the Second Afghan War. On the street, he runs into an old colleague, Stanford, with whom he worked at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. St. Bartholomew's. I'm used to saying St. Bart's. That's making my brain ache. Watson mentions that he's left the army and needs a place to live, and Stanford mentions that he has an acquaintance who is also looking for someone to share a suite of rooms. Stanford then takes Watson to the morgue, where they find the man beating corpses in an experiment to determine how long after death bruising is possible. Watson is amazed when he not only deduces that Watson has come to him about the rooms, but also correctly identifies his military service. After letting Watson know that he smokes a pipe and plays the violin, the man introduces himself as Sherlock Holmes, and his address is 221B, Baker Street. The two agree to meet the following evening to finalize the arrangements. So, I want to call out something at a I guess like a formal level that happens. I don't know if this happened in your copy because I can't remember, but this has like a previously on Sherlock explainer at the start. Was that in your copy as well?
Well, it kind of ran through the entire series. Like it was like one little blurb from each mystery that they've done so far, kind of. I don't know if that's what you saw. Yeah,
it's like a snippets of scenes. Yeah, it was really interesting that happens. Do you know why they put that in there?
I was assuming that the method that they made this, the time period of this would appeal to an entire new audience, so they can maybe draw in new fans, new viewers, just for them seeing the trailers or whatever. And they would want to watch the classic Sherlock Holmes, where they would not want to watch the new, real life version of Sherlock Holmes. So I could definitely see that. And then they would need that recap to kind of get the audience up to speed a little bit, because it ends with him being, that recap ends with him being on the plane and leaving and all that. But the one note that I had that was just so odd, considering how great the editing is in this show, but I thought that recap was the most awful editing that this show has seen so far. It was just completely artless compared to what we normally see.
So they make this entire episode and it doesn't have this explainer. They make the whole episode and it doesn't have this explainer. Then the BBC decide that they want to try something new, and they want to do a cinematic release of this episode at Christmas. So the reason it has an explainer on the front, and it's done by a whole different team, the reason it has an explainer at the front is that people were watching this in theaters, and so those people hadn't necessarily seen the television show. It was like a limited run release, and so they add this explainer at the front so that if you don't know the show at all, you can at least like go in and see it. And it's an unfortunate artifact that it is attached to all of the copies that exist because it really doesn't need it. But it was purely like a purely just like a movement of the way that capitalism functioned, in the sense of like that part exists because it needed to go to cinemas. And when we talk toward the end of this, I'll kind of give you an insight into like people's reaction to this, because Sherlock fans were not happy about this cinematic release, which I thought was really interesting. For a lot of context, I guess for people that aren't aware, like this BBC tried this at the same time with Doctor Who. They released the first 2 episodes of season 6 in theaters. So you could watch them back to back. They released the 50th anniversary in theaters as well. I went and saw those 2, but ironically didn't see The Abominable Bride for some reason. I don't think that aired here, but the other 2 definitely did, and I saw those in cinemas, which was cool. But yeah, it really just like a interesting note that we'll touch on toward the end. So what do you think about this little opening sequence here? Aside from, the shitty explainer that is really unnecessary.
I adore the decision that whoever made to start the entire thing over at the beginning, to start off exactly as we did with John having the nightmares from being at the war. They remade everything, not shot by shot, but they made it pretty close to seeing his eye when he wakes up and the flashes of battle and everything. Only they found like what was it, World War II footage, and used that, and everything was the same but in a different era, which I adored. Like the way that John met Mike Stamford and had the same conversation but had it in a slightly different language and a different setting. All of that was just brilliant. I love that they didn't start and make something brand new, but it was literally like a what if scenario, which is one of the more intriguing things about the episode. It's like, what if this entire series, but back in this era? Yeah,
100%. We'll talk a little bit, I guess, maybe probably at the very end, about like what does that really mean from a writer's perspective? Like, what does it mean to approach this era and try and redo some of the maneuvers you've already done? And where do you cut corners and where do you not cut corners and things like that? I guess
because like it could be really interesting. The same stuff that they had with the woman when she's like the naked scenes that they always play off on.
Yeah.
Like instead of that, you just have her like showing a bare ankle.
Yeah.
Because
exactly.
that would be the So they could have some really interesting stuff.
And it becomes that question of like, where do you focus your attention? What's going to feel hokey and what's going to feel authentic? And they do a really good job of kind of finding that balance, I think, in this episode. For the most part, there's one thing we'll talk about in the middle that I think is like unforgivably egregious, and whoever thought it was a good idea should be not allowed to make television anymore. Many years later, in December 1894, Holmes has become quite famous as a result of Watson's popular accounts of his cases, which are published in The Strand. Which is such a good detail. A vendor informs Watson that his latest, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, has been very well received. I'll be honest, the way that this uses the Watson Watson reading the stories as the framing device, I was so happy. I was like a pig in mud. I was like, this is the coolest thing the show's ever done. I just sat there and I was like, the first time I watched that through, I was like, this is it. Here's the I was so enthralled the first time through, and then the second time through, all I could think of was like, why isn't the main show this good? And it was that weird, like, because this, I can't stress enough. It's a little sequence. It's kind of montagey. It's kind of not montagey. Watson is doing a voiceover, but it's a voiceover where he's reading from a short story, or he's writing the account of the events. It's hard to tell precisely what's occurring. And it's like the feeling, the aesthetic of it is so on point.
So if anyone hadn't watched it, he was what Watson was doing was he was setting up the introduction to the Abominable Bride case, and he was reading out some previous cases that they had done, and he ends with something like, "But nothing tested my partner more than the case of the Abominable Bride."
Yeah.
And enter the story proper.
God, it's so good. I should say too, I want to call out something here that we'll probably talk about throughout, which is part of the reason why a lot of this works for me in the way the main show doesn't, is that the Sherlock Holmes stuff, like the apparatus of the Sherlock Holmes world, is purely sort of architecture around the story. It's not like load bearing in the way that it is in the main show. And by that I mean like the fact that Lestrade is here is part of the architecture of the plot and the mystery. It's not a piece used for character drama necessarily. There is character drama and there is comedy, but the accoutrement of like the main show and also of like the source material here is background. It's background foundational stuff to serve the mystery that's being driven at. It's not load bearing character work like it is in the main show, and that for me is like a really interesting choice. And it's part of why a lot of it doesn't feel as, I'm not sure what the right word is. We've been talking about it a lot throughout this series, but sometimes the main show can feel a little bit gimmicky or like on the nose, and this just manages to avoid that because it doesn't place these characters as load bearing in the success of the plot of the episode. It is really about the mystery, and these characters are trying to solve that mystery. With
and
the
even the
comedy,
dialogue doesn't even feel as gimmicky.
Yeah.
Because like we've noticed more and more in the I don't know how to differentiate these, the real show, that they throw in these one-liners that you're supposed to remember that one-liner. Mm-hmm. And while yes, this episode does have a lot of them, they are just ingrained with the rest of the text in such a natural way that you remember the one-liner, but it doesn't pop out as being a one-liner that was there for a purpose. It was just part of that sentence or part of that paragraph.
Well, and I think that's like because the era was when the epigram was becoming like a popular form of expression. Right, that's when Oscar Wilde is writing plays that are entirely epigrammic, sentences. This is the era where that happened, and so it feels like a natural kind of meshing of the styles where people kind of spoke like that anyway. And so when you say a really clever thing, it just sort of fits in naturally to that kind of verbosity that they naturally have. That's I hadn't thought about that. That is really interesting. It does, it doesn't strike you as weird.
For all the listeners at home that don't remember their high school studies, why don't you go through epigram real quick?
It's like a clever remark or a saying that expresses an idea in a very simple way. I'll see if I can get you like a really good Oscar Wilde epigram. He has some really great ones.
So basically, it's by that definition, it's just the first meme.
Yeah, it's like memes. God, Jesus Christ. Somewhere my like English professor just had like, I felt a shiver as he was eating his breakfast. Some of Wilde's best ones, I can resist everything except temptation. The truth is really pure and never simple, which is a very Sherlock Holmes style thing to say. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about.
There's one from this episode that stuck out to me, and I always remember because it sounds both just awesome and memorable, was "Needs must when the devil drives."
Yeah. It's very good. There's a few really good ones, but then there's some stuff toward the end that Moriarty says that doesn't make any fucking sense, which we'll talk about later. One that I love is, "When people agree with me, I feel I always must be wrong." Which is extremely good. And then one that actually ended up getting bastardized into a running club that I know is "Work is the curse of the drinking class," which is extremely good. That in my running club got bastardized to drinkers with a running problem, which is very good. So yeah, it's stylistically, everybody's talking in these kind of epigrams. It's very formal language, but it's still snippy and quick, and still has some of the main show's, I guess, kinetic energy in those conversations. But it feels a lot better suited. One thing they do too. Let me set the scene up, and then I want to get your thoughts on this characterization of Sherlock, because he is very different in some interesting and meaningful ways. So upon returning home, Holmes and Watson are surprised to find a veiled woman dressed all in black standing in the middle of the sitting room, whom Mrs. Hudson informs them is a client who refuses to speak. Holmes deduces that the woman is recently married to a kindly man who has since abandoned her for an unsavory companion, and come to Baker Street hoping to save their marriage, which he adds is evident from her perfume. When Watson expresses confusion, Holmes remarks it's unfortunate he did not also recognize the scent, before revealing that it is in fact Watson, Mary's wife. Mary Watson, John's wife. Watson asks Mary why she was disguised as a client, to which Mary responds it was the only way she could think of to see him. The two begin arguing, and Mary criticizes him for always leaving her behind when he travels the country with Holmes. Holmes interrupts him suddenly, musing vacantly that with the stage set, he is ready to begin. To Watson's confusion, he states that to solve a case, one must sometimes first solve another, an old one, and that will require him to go deeper within himself. Which is, yep, it's weird. He then barks for Inspector Lestrade, who has been hovering outside the door to enter. We'll talk about Lestrade in a sec. So, okay, a few things. Holmes here is an adult in a way that the Holmes in the show is not. And it works so well. This is such a good characterization of this version of the character. I don't know what it is, but there's they took the piss baby out of him, and all you're left with is like the snark and the intelligence and the wit and the antisocial stuff. And it works so well. I could
not put my finger on what they had changed, but you just described it so well. It's like the crybaby is gone, and he's mature.
Yeah, he feels like a world famous detective who is sort of got all these layers of society that he has wrapped around himself. You know, he speaks well, he's got, he dresses proper, like all these things kind of come together, and he feels like a man who is a part of society, rather than a man who, I don't know, like what you would call the main Sherlock, the way that he interacts with, I guess, like rather than a man who thinks it's stupid, even though this Sherlock clearly doesn't like doing all these things, he realizes their necessity. And that is maturity. Maturity is, I guess, becoming at peace with some aspects of the world that you maybe don't love. And you don't just become you don't just remain a teenage person who goes, well, things should be different. You realize that there are big complex structures and you have to sort of learn to live with some of those, even though you should keep trying to move the needle. And that's this Sherlock. He feels part of the world in a way that our main character necessarily does not in the main show. It's so good.
So does it give the writers too much credit to think that they did this on purpose, because the modern day Sherlock has all of the technology around him, has all of the current problems that our society faces, which is turning more and more people into that crybaby version of himself, whereas back in this era, they didn't have that. Do you think that this was something they intentionally did? They were like, let's mature him up, because back in those days, people literally were more mature.
Possibly. I suspect it's more likely. I mean, that is an interesting reading. Knowing Moffat's politics, that seems entirely possible. He does seem like the kind of guy who would be like, kids these days they don't understand how easy they've got it. Everyone's offended. PC culture gone mad. He does seem a bit like that kind of guy, but I suspect it's probably more just like a result of the aesthetic. It's really hard to make an stately Victorian person sound like a crybaby. Like, I don't know, that just seems like a bigger challenge. It's also, I think maybe a bit of both would be my best guess. It also seems like a lot of fun to write this kind of dialogue, and so I suspect there's probably an allure of that aesthetic of like, let's just make him a bit more mature so we can have him be kind of, a bit more of the original Sherlock Holmes. And he does feel like that. He feels like the Sherlock from the stories a lot of the time, in a way that our main Sherlock does not. So yeah, interesting thought. I would love, if you're listening to this, let us know what you think, because I'm curious as to, Tumblr has some thoughts about this, but I'm curious as to what people think the potential reason this change is made is.
There is one. Thinking back through this actual scene that we had started talking about, going into their building, you get a beautiful shot down the street where you see the horse-drawn buggies and all of this stuff, and it is beautiful set extensions.
It's so good.
And so well done, because they merged all of that with like the actual structure of the buildings in real life, and you could see both worlds there combined together. It's so well done. And then this is one of the first lines that just stuck with me because of how hilarious it was. When they go in, Mrs. Hudson is complaining to John that he never gives her any lines, and Sherlock says in frustration to John, "You need to start giving her lines because she's perfectly capable of starving us."
Yeah.
And that just hits so funny to me.
It's extremely good. Yeah, it's extremely good. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in this where it's like, they're not sexist jokes, but they're jokes about the era in a way that is interesting. There's a moment later on that falls incredibly flat for that reason with Watson and his assistant, or his housekeeper. But yeah, this stuff works really well.
Well, there is a moment with right there in this scene with John and his wife, when she finally reveals herself and says, "This was the only way I could see you," and then she says, "Why don't you just take me with you?" And John angrily says, "What would you do? You're a woman." That's what he means is, "What would you do? You're a woman." And she just looks at him and says, "What do you do?"
Yeah,
and
it's good. She's like, "What do you do except follow him around and take notes or something?"
Yeah. The dialogue between them, that was a note that I actually put down, was the dialogue between Mary and John there was so spot on that I had to make a note about how spot on that dialogue was.
That's good.
I adored it. It was so nice.
It's also really interesting knowing what we know now about Mary. It has a certain flair to it, knowing that she's probably still a spy in this era. It's cool. It's cool. I like it.
Which I assume that's what we do practically see when things evolve later on. That she is supposed to be, although I don't know how they would qualify it, because back in that day, that'd be interesting to research as, what kind of spy would she have been back in those days.
Oh, yeah, don't worry about that. Tumblr's got you covered, dog. We'll get there. We'll get there. They have some opinions. So some of them, let's just say that there's potentially this show might have attracted a certain teenage male audience who might have had some opinions about the historical accuracy of some of this, which was really just them finding ways to be sexist assholes. So we'll get there. We won't dwell on it too much, but we will touch on it. All right. Anything else, or should we get Lestrade in and set up our plot here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Lestrade enters visibly unsettled with the craziest mutton chops I've ever seen and greets Holmes, who infers that he is off duty and offers Lestrade a drink. He informs Holmes that the previous morning a woman named Amelia Ricoletti appeared on the balcony of her home dressed in a white wedding gown with the face white as death and blood apparently smeared on her mouth. In an apparent fit of madness, she began firing into the street with a pair of revolvers before eventually putting the gun in her mouth and publicly shooting herself. It had been her wedding anniversary, and following the incident, her body was taken to the morgue. Though Holmes is skeptical as to why Lestrade would need his help on such a straightforward case of suicide, Lestrade continues his story. Only a few hours later that evening, Amelia's husband, Thomas Ricoletti, was approached in the street by a cab while entering a Limehouse opium den. A veiled woman in a wedding dress exited the coach holding a shotgun, then approached Ricoletti singing. The scene attracted the attention of a nearby constable, who was, however, unarmed and unable to intervene. After asking Mr. Ricoletti whether he recognized their wedding song, the woman removed her veil to reveal her face. Mr. Ricoletti was heard identifying her as his wife, Amelia, before she shot him twice in the chest and disappeared into the fog. Watson and Mary are astonished by Lestrade's account, and Holmes reacts enthusiastically, informing Watson to ready himself for a trip to the morgue. This case fucking rules. This is such a cool, interesting setup. It's weird and unsettling, and it doesn't go too far with the jokeification stuff. This is just I was hooked. I was like, what the fuck? This is crazy. And it didn't click for me until a bit later, the parallel with Moriarty and all the stuff they're trying to do. I was just so interested in I was like, this is cool. This is crazy. That's the real success, I think, of this setup is it hooks you with a mystery that you're like, wait, what? How is that possible? I adore this setup. It's great. Also, it's an episode of Sherlock that's about the crime solving. So I was happy.
There was one little deduction I was wondering if you were going to bring up, because it was a deduction that they made in the room itself there before everything started, and they were talking about how it wasn't scared that Lestrade was, but that's what Watson deduced, was he's not angry, he's scared or something. Like, I don't remember what the first emotion was, but Sherlock was saying, "Oh, you're just this," and Watson says, "Oh, you have misdiagnosed. He is not. He is afraid." And they have the whole thing with the decanter and how he had 40% of his pieces of dialogue have been directed towards the decanter.
Yeah.
So they keep offering him drinks to restore his courage, and in honor of that, I have my own drink.
Very good.
Yes.
What
Cheers.
What have you got?
It's beautifully aged fruit punch.
Oh, okay. Not what I was expecting. All right.
Yeah, I was gonna pour a bourbon or something, but I couldn't find it. So I got fruit punch.
Well, it's 9:40 in the morning, so I do not have a whiskey. Though I have a well-stocked shelf at the moment. We get an extremely good line here as well, where and this is where I've realized that Sherlock was different. Is Watson correctly diagnoses Lestrade as being afraid, and Sherlock says something about, like, fear is wisdom. Fear is wisdom. Fear is wisdom and nothing to be ashamed of. It's such a good, like, it's such a great reaction.
Like wisdom in the face of danger or something.
Yeah, wisdom. Like fear in the face of danger is wise and nothing to be ashamed of. So, like, something like that. Yeah. And that's where it clicked. It was like, oh, this is a different Sherlock. Really, really clever. We also have to talk about this buck wild maneuver they do with the set, where there's a shot so that Lestrade is telling them about this woman firing into the street, and they do a reverse shot where they're in the living room still, but they've moved the set into the street, and they're like literally like the whole set is now in the middle of the street, so they can look out on the scene as it's happening. This is a maneuver they're going to redo, I think, episode 2 of season 4 a lot, but it's such a good effect. And the second time I sat there and I paused it and I'm like, is this fucking CG? Or do they really move the set? And there's one shot that is definitely green screen, but the shot where you get the wide angle is 100% practical. They rebuilt that entire set outside in the street, which I thought was so cool.
And I made a big note here that this is what bullet time was supposed to be used for. Yes! Exactly what it should have been used for.
They do this fucking cool maneuver where, like, as things are happening and Sherlock's asking about details, the action pauses and we, like, get bullet time rotation to focus in on a detail to get more information. It's so well done. It's like all the effects they have in their back pocket, they finally use them in the way that they're meant to be used, and it's brilliant. So I got really animated because I just, like, it's so it's baffling to me that they were able to do this when you watch the regular show and it's just such a mess all the time.
Because you can, like, look at the wedding episode and you're like, it has all of the same aspects. It has a murder, it has a mystery, it has a bullet time, it has all the camera stuff, and it's nowhere near as good. But why? And it's like these writers have their brain is wired where they can't do stuff in modern times. They have to think in old English.
Well, that's the trick that no one tells you in your writing degree, is if you just think in old timey English, you'll make a good story. I think it comes back to what we alluded to at the start, which is the Sherlock Holmes stuff is really just architecture for the mystery they're trying to tell. And so, when I say the Sherlock Holmes architecture, I mean both the short story references and the characters, but also the show's existing stylistic flourishes and aesthetic and things like that. It's all just architecture for the mystery. And so it's all in service of that. None of it is sort of in service in the other direction. None of it is in service to the architecture. The architecture is in service of the plot. And I think that's why we get this stuff firing on every cylinder. The bride singing is the creepiest thing this show has done. And there's a scene later on where I was like, yo, this is like, they've done, this is an achievement. They've done something with this episode that they can and will never do again with this show. And that's really disappointing, but also fucking awesome. They managed to get it right.
And something I'm curious if you'll bring up is the one word that the bride is always yelling is you. And I have not been able to figure out if that is supposed to reference Moriarty.
Perfect. Good. We'll get to it. Yeah, we'll get to it.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure that was somewhere in your notes there.
Yeah. Don't even worry about that. Okay, so the next scene, let me just set that up. Let me just grab that. Okay, so Mary's unhappy when Watson tells her to wait behind and prepare dinner, and informs Lestrade that she is part of a campaign for votes for women. This is just a dumb throwaway joke, and then Lestrade stupidly asks for or against.
For or against.
She gives her the most withering look I've ever seen. He's such a doofus. I love Lestrade.
But he was not being disingenuous at all. He was like really asking her.
Yeah, he like genuinely wanted to know. He wasn't being a dick. He's very funny. What do you think about these mutton chops?
I mean, it feels natural. So I mean, yeah, they look kind of goofy, but it's natural for that era. Whether or not his particular character would have chosen to have them, it doesn't matter. I didn't.
Okay, I just thought the wig was bad. That's all. I just thought whatever wig they were doing was bad. Okay, so let me see. So we've got. Oh yeah. So then Mrs. Hudson comes in and enters with a message from Mary, telling her to come immediately. Only signed M. Mary leaves, and asking Mrs. Hudson to let her husband know she'll be late for dinner. When Mrs. Hudson asks who the friend is that needs help, she simply replies England. And then Mrs. Hudson says, well, that's a bit vague. Cut that. Didn't need that. It was fine. It was fine. You didn't need that line. Upon arriving at the morgue, Holmes and Watson and Lestrade discover that the mortuary worker Anderson has chained the body to the table out of fear. Morgue director Dr. Hooper enters, and Lestrade orders Hooper to give Holmes the key facts of the investigation, despite a clearly antagonistic relationship between the two. Any notes on those little interstitial moments?
No. The next note that I have, and I don't remember which portion of it, I don't know what portion of the episode it was at, but I just wrote down "Good gravy. I love this episode." that was the next note that I had.
Oh dear. Okay.
But yep. I do love in that bit. We see that Molly is masquerading as a man, and Sherlock does not see it whatsoever. As brilliant a mind as he has, he just can't see it.
Yeah.
And at the end of that conversation, we see that John knows and lets her know that he knows, while also saying, I know Sherlock can't see this. And it's just so interesting, and I have this note later on that this episode gives John... It gives him a purpose in a way that no other episode has. Like, he's not just trailing after Sherlock like a lost puppy. Like, he actually has utility in this story. And, like, every bit of dialogue seems to have utility in this story. It's not just, like, fillers where sometimes he'll just say stuff so it gives Sherlock a prompt to fill in stuff for the audience. But it doesn't feel that way in this episode. It feels like the stuff that he's saying has weight to it. It has merit. Mm-hmm. I love everything about Watson's character in this episode. It's brilliant. I think he is my favorite part of this episode. Sherlock is just a little more mature version of, the real life, show version of him. But Watson is an entirely different character. He's, more assertive. He's more competent. Just everything about him is a better version, which maybe you could say that that's on purpose because Sherlock is doing this all in his brain. Mm-hmm. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, you're not wrong. I think there's a critique that we'll get to at the end around, like, this episode thinks it is way more feminist than it really is. And one of the issues that kind of lies at the heart of that is the way that they kind of construct John. But I agree. I think he's the best version of himself he's been. He's actually useful here. He's kind of tough as well. Like, he's not sort of the pushover he is in the main show. It's good. So Hooper states there are two important points in the case. The first is that the body has been categorically identified as that of Amelia Ricoletti, but that the woman in Limehouse was likewise identified as Amelia by both her husband and the cab driver. Watson suggests that the answer may have been twins, but Lestrade informs them that Amelia had no family beside an older brother who predeceased her by some years. And the second point, however, Hooper shows Holmes a smear of blood on Amelia's right index finger. When Watson questions its significance, Hooper informs them it wasn't there earlier. Lestrade then points to the opposite wall where he notices someone has smeared the word "you" in blood. Holmes, in a reverie, wonders how, with the gunshot wound through the back of the brain, he could have survived. Watson reminds him the victim was a woman. Okay. The Molly thing is fucking bizarre. I do not know why they decided to do this. I do not know why this contrivance was necessary. The reveal at the end isn't even that good. It's bizarre. This is where some of the criticism around it is like, they could have just written a character who was a woman who ran the morgue. That would have been fine. They could have just done that. They didn't have to like focus on it so much. I think it really undercuts the thing they're going for at the end. That's just my opinion anyway.
If the entire overarching point of the episode in that regard was that women were thought of as lesser, and so if you wrote her as a woman, then you would have to treat her completely differently to continue this overarching point that she is a lesser because she is a woman. So Anderson would have had to treat her differently. He would not have wanted to show deference to her because he's her subordinate. Watson would not have wanted to believe her examination of the body because she's a woman and she missed something, so he would have wanted to examine it too. It would have added all of this extra drama that's not necessarily... I think it would have added too much drama that they would have had to dig through, which wasn't really the main point of it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas having her purposefully masquerading as a man also gets across the same message, but it does it where you don't have to devote more story time to really digging into why she had to do that.
I guess. I mean, I can see that. I can see that. I think that's a really valid observation, and it's probably like the reason this happened. I just think like, you don't need to do this. It's the one part of the episode that feels hokey and weird, and like, it just, I would have simply not done this if I was writing this. I would have found a way to work around it.
Yeah, I can see why you're saying that, but I'd also be curious to figure out what exactly is it that feels hokey, and could it be written out? Because it also feels like it could have a lot of merit, just the way that it was done. And the idea, I mean, that's not a brand new idea that they did, that someone has to masquerade as the other sex in order to get ahead. So it'd just be interesting.
No, I don't disagree. We get a really good, I guess like a House MD reference, kinda, where, Watson's like, could it be twins? And Sherlock's like, it's never twins, which is, it's never lupus. I
knew something felt familiar in that, and that's got to be what
someone
it
on
was.
Tumblr pointed that out, and I was like, that's sick as hell. It's very funny. For those who don't know, in House MD, which is a sort of adaptation of Sherlock, one of the things House always, his team, whenever they're pitching kind of diagnoses and things like that, someone will always suggest lupus at some point during like a season, and it's like the thing that they all say is like, it's never lupus, and it's never once been lupus in the show, which is great.
I think that was a direct reference, because that's exactly Sherlock's words. He says it's never twins.
It's definitely a reference. Yeah,
it's got to be.
It makes it into the Wikipedia trivia section of the episode, so that's how you know it's legit.
Because the internet said so.
Because the Sherlock Holmes wiki said so.
Who would trust people who put stuff out on the internet? I mean,
man, if only somebody did significant research each week to understand what is and is not true that the internet is saying about this episode. I wonder if someone on this show is doing that. Okay, so let's try. It is definitely a reference. Just I was not being facetious. Okay, so we get this when Sherlock says the he thing. How could he have survived? That was when it clicked for me. I was like, oh, he's solving Moriarty's murder, or Moriarty's suicide, which in watching it a second time, I was like, wow, that's heavy-handed. But then, given I didn't notice it the first time, I was like, I guess you need that in there in case, like me, you're so enjoying yourself that you forget this is part of the other show. Like, I'd forgotten that this was related in some way.
And I love that idea too, that you can't solve one murder without solving a different murder first.
Yes.
Which is really interesting. I don't know how much water that holds, because he's going back and imagining something that there is so little data on. There's only probably like secondhand accounts of what actually happened. It would make I don't know. Maybe there's just not that many examples of murders in history where the murderer came back to life and kept killing people. So he didn't really have much else to go on.
It also, I guess the thing that this had, because I was gonna say, like, why doesn't he just imagine what happened, which is like Moriarty killing himself and imagine scenarios for him coming back. But I guess the historical account is like that person did come back from the dead apparently, and so maybe you're right. It's the only time that's happened, sort of thing. Yeah, interesting. I don't want to tell you what you means yet. I think we should wait to the end. Maybe. Okay. Okay. Just think about the fact that, like, the bride is a persona that's being controlled by somebody else. He's trying to solve Moriarty's murder. Or Moriarty's suicide. That's all I'll say. We'll get there. I have to find a way to tell you what it means without spoiling the end of the show, so that's going to be fun. Holmes thanks Lestrade and Hooper for a fascinating case, announcing that he will telegram once he has solved it, then leaves. Watson gives some last minute advice to Hooper, saying that though clearly the gunshot was the cause of death, it would be worthwhile to perform an autopsy as the victim shows clear signs of consumption. Hooper slights him, mocking his sudden perceptiveness while Holmes is gone. Watson retorts that he is indeed observant, while Holmes can be surprisingly blind, and comments to Hooper, amazing what one has to do to get ahead in a man's world. Before leaving, he clearly knows that she is a woman. We get our first marker of the solve here, which is the consumption. The fact that, like, she's already sick before she committed suicide. Interesting. So first little, like, hey, here's the first clue. And I was like, oh, that is interesting. And the fact that she wrote on the wall after she died, I was like, you get your second clue. It's good. It's all here. In the carriage ride back, Holmes admits to being puzzled, commenting that the case is leading him into deep waters, and to solve it, he will need to go deeper still. The exact line, which I thought was really good, is he says, quote, "These are deep waters, Watson. Deep waters, and I shall have to go deeper still." It's just a really good line. It's really good.
Yeah. I think the one that you complained about before was because he said, I have to go deeper inside myself, which sounds more hokey, but it's the exact same thing.
Yeah. It's just less interesting. It's just less obvious. Wait, because it sounds like a thing someone from that era might say, absent the Mind Palace stuff. That's why it works for me. All right, anything on the morgue and I guess our little transition here?
No, my next one is about the maid scene.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so several months pass with no progress on the Riccoletti case. Lestrade visits Holmes at Baker Street to inform him of 5 new murders that have been blamed on the ghost, now called the Bride. Holmes remains uninterested, explaining these are obviously copycats. Although that being said, Lestrade does tell him that all the men were killed the same way, murdered in their homes with rice thrown on the floor, like at a wedding, and the word "you" written in blood on the wall. Holmes, however, dismisses the murders as copycats, as I said, inspired by the extensive press coverage. Holmes calls for Watson, but Lestrade reminds him that Watson moved out some time ago and Holmes is alone. At Watson's home, the doctor sitting down to breakfast notices his wife is absent. He summons his maid Jane, who rebuffs his questions with the observation that the couple are rarely home together, and this infuriates Watson. Watson receives a telegram from Jane directing him to meet Sherlock and his brother, Mycroft. I said this before, this scene fucking sucks to watch. I get what they're going for, but the way that they take this characterization of Watson and warp him to suit this scene is just like, I found it a bit uncomfortable and not in a way that the show was going for. Like, it didn't work for me. Yeah. What did you think of this? Because you like this version of Watson, so I'm curious as to how you kind of work through this. Yeah. What
I did not see this as warping his character because, well, okay. I did not see this as warping his character for this scene because his entire character is warped into this misogynistic version that all men had back then. So everything that he said seemed perfectly natural because that's how men treated women in every situation, except for like maybe their wife who's on a little higher standard, But I adored that scene. I literally laughed out loud both times that I watched it. And I adored the dialogue. I adored the dainty little way that he rings the bell.
Oh, that is very good. Yeah.
and it's like some of the dialogue, like, you are dangerously close to impertinence. If my wife did not handle the household duties,
he's like, I have to have a word to my wife to have a word with you. Like, that stuff is good. Yeah, I like that stuff.
Yes, and then she immediately says, "Well, when are you going to see her again?"
Jane's great. Jane, I'm like, this character is fantastic. Get her in the fucking main show. Let's go.
Yeah, so like the dialogue is uncomfortable. Like you said, the intention is to be uncomfortable. You're feeling uncomfortable because that version of Watson is supposed to be the good guy, whereas I am just seeing like the overarching story is that all men are bad guys. Be that as it is.
It's possible the scene is working then. I would just rather not have it in this really great episode of television that I had a great time with. That's all. Why I see what you're saying. I understand why you enjoyed it and what it's going for. It just didn't work for me. That's all. I think it's one of those things of like our mileage always varies on different things. I think for me probably it's just like I've read too much and consumed too much media that does this kind of thing, and I don't need to see it again. Like, it feels very played out, even at the time. Maybe not at the time. At the time, this was how you did feminism. Was why recreating bad behaviors and being like, isn't that fucking stupid? Why would anyone behave that way? And we've just moved so far past that now that I think in particular, knowing the way that people react to this episode on Tumblr, watching it a second time, it probably just rubbed me the wrong way because I could see how people would take all of this and interpret it the incorrect way. Because what you said is the correct reading of this scene. I'm just jaded, I guess. Cool. Should we talk about the Diogenes Club?
Yes.
Okay. Look, there's a really funny bit, and then there's something that is really unfortunate. Okay. Arriving at the Diogenes Club, where absolute silence is maintained at all times, Holmes and Watson are directed by the concierge Wilder to the stranger's room where Mycroft is eating breakfast. Wilder congratulates Watson on the success of the blue carbuncle, to which Watson clumsily expresses his gratitude. In the stranger's room, they find the enormously obese Mycroft sitting surrounded by a vast array of foods. After greeting the elder Holmes, Watson comments that his level of consumption is going to kill him within 5 years, and is horrified when the Holmes brothers begin to bet on how long it will be before Mycroft dies. The two banter, and then Mycroft explains he has a case for Sherlock, who accepts. Okay, so first of all, the sign language stuff is incredibly funny. I was like, as they were doing it, I was like, this is stupid. And then when Watson says, like, he signs ugly, I was laughing out. I was laughing out loud. It's so funny both times. It's so... There's this pause and it's good. If you haven't seen it, basically, the Diogenes Club, you can't speak. And so in this version, Holmes and Watson speak to the concierge in sign language. And Sherlock is very fluent and Watson clearly isn't. And in response to a compliment about the story, Watson is like, thank you. That was a very ugly thing you said about the story, or something like that. And it's so fucking funny, man. Like I was having a great time with this.
I thanks to this episode, I now know. I already knew how to say hi, and now I know how to say hi, ugly.
It's so... you should YouTube this scene if you haven't seen it. It's very funny. Okay, so that scene's great. We have to talk about the Mycroft stuff, and I'd rather not, but I guess I'm just going to try and bull through it and kind of lay this out. So they've put Mark Gatiss in a fat suit. They've given him, what do you call it? Prosthetics and things like that on his face, and he's wearing clearly like prosthetics on his hands. It's deliberately gross and weird. Don't get me wrong. I understand what they're trying to do. I want to give you a bit of context on Mycroft from the stories, and then probably just talk through what. Yeah, we'll talk it through. So Mycroft is described in the stories as as a larger and stouter man than Sherlock. In the Bruce Parlington plans, Watson describes him as follows: quote, Heavily built and massive, there was a suggestion of uncouth physical inertia in the figure. But above this unwieldy frame, there was perched a head so masterful in its brow, so alert in its steel grey, deep-set eyes, so firm in its lips, and so subtle in its play of expression, that after the first glance, one forgot the gross body and remembered only the dominant mind. Quote. So there's an argument that this is like a valid realization of the original character from the stories, in the sense that like he is large and obese in the original stories, but the way that they play this and the way they play this off is the only reason. So the implications of this is the only reason that Mycroft would ever be fat is to win a bet with Sherlock. In the original stories, the reason he's large is he's like not interested in the physical world. He's so concerned with the intelligence and the this, that, and the fifth, and the mysteries and the intelligence service that he just doesn't like value his physical appearance or his health, right? He's too preoccupied. The way that the implication of doing this is something that Steve has done before, which is this idea that like the only reason someone would be obese is like, or that someone should be obese is on purpose, and that being obese is like inherently like a wrong thing to do. Or is inherently the non-normal state for a person to be in, I guess. It normalizes a certain body type and body weight. Now, don't get me wrong, like, from a health perspective, yes, obesity is bad, and we know that it's an issue in our society. But the way that this frames it is so particularly not lazy, but it just doesn't take this. It doesn't take this characterization or this movement, I guess, seriously enough. It plays it off as a joke in a way that some of the other stuff, like the sexist jokes and things like that, work because it knows that on face that behavior is wrong. This, like, errs just enough on the side of, like, they're not laughing with, the sexist stuff, they're laughing with the feminists, right? They're like, this is bad, and it's funny for that reason. This is laughing at obese people. The butt of the joke is people that are fat. In this kind of, as you pull it apart, on surface, it's not that. On surface, it's just like, yeah, it's a funny joke that they would bet about his life. But the more you kind of pull it apart and kind of draw that out, it is really like laughing at the fat people. It thinks that they're gross, and it thinks it's funny to point that out, and that it's funny that the only reason that Mycroft would be fat is for this reason. They are also doing a specific thing from we haven't really decided what to call it. The real show? I don't know. Because in the real show, Mycroft is always concerned about his weight, and he's always working out. He's always on a treadmill, and he's doing this, that, and the fifth thing, and he's ashamed of the fact that he works out. So there's something happening there as well. But yeah, I just wanted to, I guess, try and lay that out because it's something that Tumblr really like nails on pretty quickly. They're like, hey, this is like, even for like 2014 or whatever this was, it's pretty shitty. Like, this is a pretty shitty thing to do. It's lazy and it's not that funny. And it's also like they make it gross. They make his obesity deliberately gross, right? Like he's picking up these big puddings, that he's kind of squishing as he picks them up. Like it's visually disgusting. And like obese people aren't disgusting. And there's something about that which I just think is like, there's a way that this could have been done that would have got the point across without this ending up being a joke at the expense of people that are obese and have these health issues. Yeah, just to lay that out, and that I don't always bring in like, I guess, like the kind of like political side of the way that text is read, but I think it's really important in this context, particularly when we talked at the end about the reveal and the sexism stuff and what Tumblr thinks. This is one thing that they immediately latch onto and go, hey, this is bad. And I think that's really interesting that this is something Tumblr users have a really good legibility over, whereas a lot of the other stuff, like we've been talking about this whole time, these the queer coding and the queer baiting and the metas and all this stuff, they don't have great tools for textual legibility there, but for this, it's really easy because it's so clumsy, maybe. Or it just had been done to death. We've seen fat jokes done in the early aughts to death, and maybe it was just like people had developed the tooling to identify it in the same way we have tooling to sort of identify sexism and intersectionality and stuff now. It's just interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It didn't really clock with me how unusual that scene was. I loved how it looked. The aesthetics of the fat suit
Mm.
just seemed to fit him really really well, and I loved the staging of everything was just amazing to me. But I guess the writers wanted to do it as like an homage or whatever, and it just didn't really hit them that bigger is not always better.
Did you have that prepared? Is that a prepared? So for those listening, this entire time Darth started by like mouthing a pipe, and then he was mouthing a small cigar, and as he said that line, he has swapped to a cigar that is as large as his head. Was that a pre-prepared joke, or that was just on your desk?
I had it for this episode, and I did not know where to use it,
And
so
you
I am
found a
so
pun
glad
there.
that it.
Yeah, it's good. That was good. God damn it. We definitely during our last episode we definitely should smoke a cigar to see the show off. There's always better. I love that. What a great way to wrap up that point. I like that. I'm like, hey, here's a really complicated thing to unpack that is like really fraught with danger, and I'm trying to be very sort of careful in the way that I unpack it. And then you just come in with the pun, and it like, I mean, what a pun as well. It was brilliant. Yeah. Yeah. It just. Bad sucks. It's bad. Don't do it. Don't do it. It's lazy. It's lazy. So yeah. Any notes on this sequence? Outside of that.
One thing that really hit me when they got inside the club, which you could see this throughout the entire episode, and you had mentioned the aesthetic of it, but it really hit me when they were in there, and they do this amazing thing with the lighting in this episode, where they have the light source that's usually coming from inside a window. There's usually rather dim lighting in the room, so you have these incredibly dark, deep shadows, and this like almost overexposed lighting source coming through the window. So it's incredibly bright. You have this amazing volumetric lighting where you could see, it's like where you could see the light beams coming through dust or whatever. That's what the volumetric lighting is. And in almost every scene in this episode, you have that. And that's either supposed to just kind of give you a hint of like the dusty, stuffy feeling that the rooms are in, but I adore the visual aesthetic that they chose for this episode, and the way that they pulled all of this off visually. It gives it a feeling of old timiness without having to introduce a ton of like grain or mute the colors, so it's not as saturated as normal footage, or like they didn't really do anything like that. It's all the lighting style that really sold how old it. And I was kind of playing around with it, and I was like, if I just like turn off that light, and I'm like, this feels more like that episode just from having the light hitting me from the side. And it's all this really cool thing that all this stuff you could do with lighting that just changes the dynamic of what the audience is perceiving.
It's such a no, I hadn't noticed that, but it is striking. The way they use contrast in this episode is striking. It's really well thought out. The way that they do this right practically is when they are building these sets, where obviously the windows aren't going outside, they're on a soundstage for the most part. They put these giant like high Kelvin lights, in behind that window, and they just blast it with like, a very small, high intensity, high temperature light that just like punches through, and then you, as you said before, you then kind of crank your exposure, and so what ends up happening is that your brights get brighter and your darks kind of get dimmer. This would eventually, in like a technical sense, become how HDR works. On television's hyperdynamic range. And so it's interesting to me that this show and this episode has an aesthetic that is so precise, and that aesthetic, like the precision of the aesthetic, not the aesthetic itself, is going to come into season 4 for the first 2 episodes, and then they completely they run out of steam in the final episode, and it looks very, very different. But they use the same idea of the very directional lighting in I think it's whichever one is like the drug episode. I think it's episode 2 of season 4. To what might be the most brilliant effect that the show has ever. Like, that episode has some of the most brilliant visual effects, and they clearly realized a lot of how they were doing stuff from this episode, and they bring it forward in a way that is excellent. But yeah, you're right. It is simple. It's simple stuff. It's simple filmmaking, but it's also like you can tell that the people they have producing the show are experts in their field. And like, again, as we've said, the production quality has never been the issue. The show has always looked amazing. But this is people like at the top of their game doing a thing that they probably get to do pretty rarely. And it works super well. It's good. This episode rocks. It's so good. Any other notes, or should we get to Lady Carmichael?
Yep, she's the next one I got.
Yeah. So the client, Lady Carmichael, arrives at Baker Street that afternoon to ask Holmes for help. She relates how the previous Monday, her husband, Sir Eustace Carmichael, received a blank envelope containing 5 orange pips while at breakfast. Holmes inquires whether Sir Eustace had spent time in Africa, but Lady Carmichael responds that she did not believe he had. She then recounts how 2 days later, her husband awoke in the night and was paralyzed with fear after believing he saw the bride in his garden, saying that she had come for him and that his sins had found him out. Lady Carmichael states that she found nothing that night, but early the next morning, she saw her husband go out into the labyrinth on the grounds. Following him, she heard singing and found her husband face to face with the ghastly bride, whom he identified as Emilia Ricoletti. Ricoletti told Eustace that he would die that night before he fainted. Lady Carmichael explains that her husband refuses to talk about the matter and does not want to leave the house. Holmes is pleased by this, as he intends to use Sir Eustace as bait to catch the murderer. Holmes tells her to head home immediately and says that he and Watson will be on the next train to ensure her husband's safety. Look, a few things here that are really cool. The bride stuff is still creepy as shit. I don't know how they did this, but it is like they must have had like hella fog machines on set and stuff, because it's so creepy, man. Like, especially like first thing in the morning. It adds a flair that feels very like Haunting of Hill House or something like that. You can really feel the bones of that style here. Yeah, it's great.
I've always wondered how realistic the fog is, because like in almost every depiction of shows from overseas, you see this like deep fog at night and in the morning, and in America we just have like scalding sun.
Particularly in England during winter, the fog is crazy. Like, it's to the point where like some days you can't drive. Like, they'll put out like a weather warning of like, this fog is so bad that you shouldn't be on the road, kind of thing. Like, it's crazy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Little tidbit of realism for me.
There you go. Cool. You learn something new every day on this podcast, even if you didn't want to. You're welcome.
So, I adore the bride stuff. I'm pretty sure at one point that they put her on a little hoverboard, you know, those little rolling Segway things, because she comes floating towards the camera.
Yeah.
But one thing that I just thought was hilarious once I stopped and really thought about it, because when Sir Eustace faints, and part of you is thinking, what kind of guy just faints like that?
Yeah, it's weird.
But then the other part of me thinks about, like, it's actually realistic, because we are, as a society, we are so desensitized because we've seen this stuff all of the time. But for him, he's like never seen a ghost. Like, we've seen movies of ghosts for the past like 20 years. You know, it's like nothing new to us. We've seen demons transform, and we've seen all kinds of incredible stuff in movies that has desensitized us. But if he saw those same things, it would terrify him so much. And people probably literally did faint easier back in the day.
Oh, yeah.
Because they just hadn't experienced these things, because there was no way to do recordings and show people, oh, you know, this thing happened. This person got hit by a car. Well, no one saw it, but now it's on video. Now everyone can see it.
It's a good point. But also, like, it is creepy as hell, so it didn't strike me as weird that he fainted. I was like, this is if there were a moment to faint, this would be the moment to faint, frankly.
Yeah, that was just one of the weird places where my brain sometimes goes, and I was like, is the fainting realistic, and why would it be realistic? And then that's where that whole thought process took me. I wonder if anyone is
your pen an American flag?
Yes, I'm American.
What is going on? What is happening today? You got big cigars. You got what? You got an American flag pen. An American flag pen is the bizarrest shit ever. Why would you put a flag on a pen?
Well, I couldn't figure out where to put this little bit about my notes that I have on this scroll. It's a really cool note that I was going to use, but it's actually the Declaration of Independence.
You just have that? Oh my god! You just have a Declaration of Independence prop? America's fucking man. There's something y'all are doing it wrong. I don't know what's going on over there, but there's something. It's gone. Things broke bad in America a long time ago. Clearly, it's no wonder you guys have so many problems. Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I didn't think to bring my bowl of knives over here so I could display them as well.
Well, don't worry. We've seen that in previous episodes. You don't have to. The bowl. Listen. I fucking wild. I could not. It would be so offensive to. People would be so offended if I had like an Australian flag pen. Like that idea of that level of nationalism is so like gauche here. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite here. It's like if you don't have your flag on your swim trunks, then it just is weird.
It's here if you're like if you do that kind of thing, like if you have the flag, a lot of people will get like the Southern Cross tattooed on them or something. It's a real sign of like you're like a bogan, like you're like a redneck kind of thing. It's really
actually same.
Yeah,
same.
It's really uncivilized to be wearing the flag here, because Australians hate our country more than anyone else. Because we know what happens here, and we're like, we should not be proud of this. It's just interesting, that cultural difference. Anyway, I'll save that for our other podcast. Things that Darth tells me that I can hardly believe about America.
I should make a list and actually do that in earnest and see if I can get you just to disconnect in shame.
It's not just fear and confusion and concern. Like, it's no wonder that, it's like Mad Max over there. Truly some heinous shit. Okay, do you have any notes, or should we I guess, keep moving here?
The last I had was at the very end of the story, the camera is kind of looking down onto the hedge maze, and then the camera tilts, and the hedge maze turns into Sherlock's fingers that he's holding up like this as the scene transitions back to their living room there. Beautiful transition. Oh,
I remember that
so
really
good.
It's so vivid as well.
Yeah, so good. And then I don't have it written down, so I might forget it. But when they go back and they're waiting for the ghost to show up, the transition that they did there mimics a clock. The camera spins in a circle, and you hear the ticking of a clock. And it is such a I never noticed that until like my second watch through, and I was like, that is such an interesting way of showing they did like a day to night transition in the spinning camera. And then with the clock and everything finally clicked, and I was like, oh, they're actually doing a clock thing. That's really cool.
It's like clever, but it looks like shit the second time. Like that second transition looks bad visually.
Yeah, it's weird to say that I appreciated what they did, but I did not like it aesthetically. But still, the idea was cool.
Darth explains my entire viewing experience of Sherlock. I appreciate what they were going for, but I didn't enjoy it.
Yep.
Put that on the fucking t-shirt. There's a few really cool transitions in this episode, actually, and a few really bad ones. So in the Diogenes Club, Mycroft Holmes receives Mary Watson and informs her that his brother has taken the case, assigning her to discreetly keep an eye on him. Back on the train to the Carmichael estate, Holmes flatly rejects Watson's suggestion that there may be a supernatural element to the case. He tells his companion that there are no such thing as ghosts, save those that we make for ourselves. Once again, a nice little epigram. At the estate, Sir Eustace denies his wife's account of the past week, blaming his appearance in the garden on sleepwalking, and dismissing the envelope as a grotesque joke, insisting his wife is nothing but a hysteric prone to fantasies. But Holmes rebukes him, insisting Lady Carmichael is highly intelligent and perceptive. When asked about the Ricoletti case, Sir Eustace denies a connection, but gives himself away when he refers to Ricoletti as a woman, in spite of Holmes never mentioning that fact. Nevertheless, he rejects Holmes' help and refuses to speak to him further. So that line where he's like, "There are no such thing as ghosts, save those who make for ourselves." Excellent, really good dialogue, fits really well. I wish the show was this good all the time. Makes me mad. So the 5 orange pips, we've talked about the orange pips before in that episode. Yeah, okay. So for those who don't remember, orange pips is like it's a famous thing in a Sherlock. It's the first Sherlock Holmes story, and it's like a threat basically from America, I believe. Okay, do you have anything on, I guess, Eustace here in this whole setup?
It did come off a bit odd how reluctant he was to accept help, but I don't know if that was kind of playing into even more so back in the day that men would not ask for help ever and were they were supposed to be the stoic people who were unafraid of anything. We've been thankfully coming more and more away from that now. But I don't know if that's what they were going for, where it was natural for the man to refuse help and say, "Oh, I wasn't really afraid. No, I didn't see a ghost, blah, blah, blah."
I kind of thought he was doing it because if he admitted that he'd seen it, he'd have to explain why, like his connection to Ricoletti. I thought he was sort of trying to avoid giving away that, like, what he'd done. That was kind of how I read it.
At the same time, like, if you know for a fact that a vengeful ghost is coming to kill you, wouldn't it be better to take the hit on your criminal record
Probably,
and tell what you did
Probably,
than
yes.
risk dying?
But that's the point that the episode is trying to make, right? Is that, like, his pride and his awfulness are what get him killed. And his view of women is what gets him killed, ultimately. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's clearly what's happening here. I just think it plays into, like, the larger theme a little bit. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah, no other notes.
Okay. As they leave, Holmes tells Watson that Lady Carmichael will sleep alone and that all the doors and windows of the house will be locked. He predicts the bride will attempt to lure Eustace outside and is unsure whether he will follow due to an all-consuming guilt. He reveals the orange pips are a traditional warning of avenging death from America. There you go. And that Sir Eustace's guilt must be connected to Amelia Ricoletti. Holmes asks Watson if he has his revolver, and the two prepare to wait for nightfall. Holmes and Watson wait near the house in a potting shed for the ghost to appear, which is the most British thing ever. Around midnight... Okay, so we'll talk about the conversation they have in a second. Around midnight, Sir Eustace and Lady Carmichael go to sleep. To pass the time, Watson probes Holmes about his feelings for Lady Carmichael and for women in general, admitting he saw the photograph of Adler in Holmes' watch. Watson continues pressing, determined to find out what made Holmes who he is, to which Sherlock replies, "I made me." I've written down here, I bet Darth really enjoyed this conversation. This seems like his exact kind of bullshit. Did you like this, did you like this conversation?
I actually have no notes about this. I keep going back and forth as to whether I actually enjoyed it or not. Like, I can't say that the entire conversation doesn't feel natural. That would be a very natural thing for two friends of this caliber to try to have a conversation, except one of them is an android and doesn't understand why you're trying to talk with him about mating stuff. So I don't know. I'm so on the fence as to whether I liked it or not. I don't know. I see the overall flow of like, you should, this woman is really brilliant and you should go after her, because that's been like an overarching theme in the Sherlock stories so far, is that every time that there's an intelligent woman, they get along really well, even if he Janines her and does stupid.
Yeah, so what I really appreciate about this is it's a conversation that our real characters could never have. Because Sherlock would just, would shut it down and not engage in it at all. This version of Sherlock is a bit more mature. Like, while he still is like, I don't want to talk about this, he engages with Watson about it, and they talk about it properly. Not in the type of conversation that, like, you would actually have with a friend who isn't Sherlock, but you get more from him about his feelings on it, and he doesn't default to being a piss baby. He sort of has to work it through with Watson and be like, this is the reason I want to talk about it. You know, why should it matter to me? And Watson persists, and you eventually get to that point at the end where Watson's kind of like, you know, like why do you feel the need to be alone? And it's such a good question that is like, it drives at the heart of this character, and in particular, like the character that we see in the main story, but it's in a more mature context, and so you actually get like a proper. It's not like a bloody no one made me, I'm bloody Sherlock, bloody Holmes, mate. It's like it's a very mournful kind of like austere, like I made me, like I made myself like this. It's not tragic. Tragic's maybe too strong of a word, but it's authentic in a way that the real show can never really get to because of the apparatus that's put in place. And so I that's the reason I thought you'd really like it, because it takes a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about in the main show, which the show is obviously doing. They're clearly exploring this idea of Sherlock's relationship with women. Just saying that for the Tumblr users out there. It's clearly what the show is interested in. But he takes all those and is able to actually titrate them into a real conversation. And actually address and talk about the themes, right? Something you often criticize text for is the idea that, like, if something isn't necessarily made explicit or part of the core conceit of the show, it being subtext can often be a challenge for a lot of readers, or it, you know, just because it's implied doesn't mean that it's, you know, necessarily there or working properly. And this feels like, to me, the right balance of subtext and text. Yeah.
Another interesting thought about it is that what if, because you were saying that the reason they could have this conversation to the degree that they even were able to was because Sherlock was more mature, but at the same time you could look at it from the direction that, because you even said it, that Watson kept coming back and kept pressuring him, and I think that the real version of Watson was too timid to continually pressure him for an answer, whereas this version of Watson is more aggressive, and that's why he was actually able to keep pushing and get more answers and push the conversation forward. I don't see the real John actually being so aggressive to get this conversation going as far as it did. I still don't feel like he actually got any answers, and there wasn't really much point to the conversation, because it just kind of ended with Sherlock saying, I am who I am and no one made me, and this is what it is, which isn't necessarily a good answer to what John was asking. But still, it's like we're analyzing a scene where both characters are different than their entire history that we've seen. So it's really hard to tell, are they acting properly for this version of the character, or is this all a metaphor for something else, or who knows?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably and this whole episode is about Sherlock's relationship to women in a certain sense. And for me at least, like, this idea of I made me, and like sort of like, no, like, you know, John is angling toward like, oh, well, clearly like a woman hurt you and that's why you're this way, sort of presuming that potentially it was Adler or something like that. But Sherlock is kind of like, no, like I've always been this way. You know, a woman didn't make me this way, which is interesting if you think about what we learn at the end of season 4 and why Sherlock is the way he is. Right? And so there's this kind of interesting like mixing of analogies here and analogs where it's like Sherlock is so certain about this. I'm trying to talk about it without spoiling it. Sherlock is so certain that he made himself this way. And when we learn that there was sort of potentially other reasons, it completely changes the foundation of who he is, in a very real sense. And this to me feels like these two characters in a different setting. It's Sherlock having a conversation with himself about his view on women. That's literally what's happening here. Like, he's working it through with himself, and concluding like, well, no, I made myself this way. So even in like in his interior, he believes that, which may or may not be true. We'll sort of find out the further into the kind of his backstory that we get. I just think it's interesting. I just think it's a really interesting kind of like little thing that they're doing, a little thing they're putting. It's no accident that this episode is very focused on women's rights and Sherlock's relationship with women, given where the show ends, is what I would say. Yeah. So The conversation is interrupted when Holmes spots the bride on the terrace. Holmes and Watson race toward the spectre, but it disappears as they approach. Suddenly, they hear Sir Eustace scream from upstairs, and they hear the sound of breaking glass. Holmes and Watson rush to the house, but finding the door locked, they are forced to break a window to enter. Holmes leaves Watson to guard the broken window in case the culprit should attempt to escape that way. Going higher up, he finds Sir Eustace lying on the floor in a narrow hallway, stabbed in the chest with a dagger. Another woman screams, and downstairs Watson hears singing and turns to find the bride behind him. He runs into the foyer, where he collides with Holmes. Watson insists he saw a ghost, but Holmes insists there is no such thing. Then we sort of cut to the corpse, I guess. Aside from how kinetic and frantic this whole scene is, do you have any thoughts on, like, I guess the murder of Eustace here and the setup?
I really disliked the... I don't know if it was the angles that they chose or what, but the when they see the bride on the terrace, what we are supposed to see is a ghostly figure that you could actually see through, and then she disappears and fades into nothingness. That's what you're supposed to see. What you actually see is her walking backwards into a shadow.
It's very confusing. Like, visually, it's a confusing way to film that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and what they were trying to do was an old theater trick where they have a huge pane of glass, and they are like projecting her reflection onto the glass, and then you see through the glass, but you also see her reflection. So it makes her have this ghostly appearance. But maybe it would have been better if they actually shot that practically instead of trying to do whatever effect they did that didn't come across well whatsoever. Because, like I said, it literally just looked like she walked backwards into the shadows, and then they explained the whole thing with the glass later on, and I'm like, that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. That's not at all what I saw.
Mm-hmm. No, neither. I was very confused. I think it was a weird way to film it. Like, I just thought it was, it just wasn't clear what was happening.
Yeah. And it maybe some dialogue could have helped, because they had to have seen that in editing. And maybe they couldn't go back and do reshoots or whatever, but some dialogue, even if it was ADR, some dialogue could have cleaned up the confusion. Just saying, we didn't just see her, we saw through her. She was intangible. Like, that should have affected them more than everything they've seen so far, unless Sherlock immediately made this connection with the old theater trick, you know. Mm-hmm. But seeing the ghost and seeing a ghost where you could see through it is, for this day and age, you know, that would be very uncommon. You know, now we have holograms and all kinds of stuff where you would be like, oh, that's neat, and then you walk on to something else.
Uh-huh. I mean, maybe in America, I don't know. You're living in the weird post-apocalypse over there. You got holograms and shit in that like Hunger Games dystopia.
Yeah. But we're prepared for the fight. What about you?
Not at all. No. Well, this Mad Max is sat here for a reason. Let me tell you that much. Okay.
Now I'm picturing this version of Hunger Games where you have the scholars who are over here and they're just like quoting Macbeth while everyone's fighting to the death.
Yeah, 100%. It'd be great. So good. Yeah. Arguing over which Shakespeare play is the best. Yeah.
So the only other thing in this scene that I wanted to point out is I was curious if did you notice anything about the house, especially that upstairs hallway?
No. Should I have?
I have not done a side-by-side, but I will bet some money, not a lot, but I'll bet some, that is the same exact hallway where it was the kids at their dormitory where the kids got kidnapped and he got drugged down the hall and Sherlock bends down and he gets the mud off, because it has this like slanted ceiling and it's a narrow hallway, slanted ceiling, wooden floor.
Yep.
It looks so close that I was betting they just reused a set, or they reused a film location. Mm-hmm. But this is also my note to go back and check that, because I was really curious.
Yeah. I like that you're like, prepare for this episode, go back and check it. You're like, wait, but I'm in the episode. Hang on. Wait, what? Yeah, that's an interesting note.
It's actually funny when when I was first starting to make movies, I would actually look directly at the camera and tell myself notes, because I was going to be the one editing the movie.
Oh, smart. So, yeah.
Yeah. And then every once in a while, the actors would see me doing it, so then they would start doing it too. In the middle of a line, they would stop, they would whip around to face the camera, and they would say, "Hey, we're watching you!"
Yeah. I mean, I used to just, during an episode, I'd just tell Pat what to do when he was sitting at the production desk. We'd be doing an episode of the podcast and be like, "Pat, can I see a graphic like this on screen, please?" Or like, "Could you do this?" Yeah, it's good shit. God, that makes me long for a version of this show where like Sherlock just talks directly to camera, like just jims the camera constantly. It'd be very good.
It's really interesting how we've switched from saying that that's pulling a Zach Morris to now that's pulling a Jim. I just wanted to.
Isn't it interesting? Especially given The Office isn't that good. Hot take.
Oh.
Both versions aren't particularly funny. There, I said it. Yeah. Anyway, it's fine.
Okay.
It's fine.
Yeah, I'm about to go off.
Yeah. We're not going to talk about it. We're not going to talk about it.
Rain check.
Look,
Rain
you were the
check.
guy that thought Sherlock was good, all right? So I don't know if you should be trusting any of your latent opinions from earlier on. So, all right, we'll set up the kind of little mystery here, and then we'll take a quick break and come back and I guess get to the ending of the episode, which is like pretty quick to happen. So Watson determines that Sir Eustace was stabbed with considerable force. Lestrade assumes the killer might have been a man, but given the sharpness of the blade, it could have also been a woman. Watson again insists that he saw Amelia, which Holmes again refuses to believe. He retorts that after eliminating the possible, the ghost, there is only one suspect with the motive and means to commit the crime. Though he notes that despite the sound of breaking glass, he heard they only found one broken window, which was when they entered through. Lestrade tells Holmes there was a message attached to the dagger, although Sherlock insists there was none when he found the body. Looking again, he finds a card that says "Miss Me" tied to the handle. So this is interesting. You know, this addition of the note after the fact, I thought was really interesting. Obviously, "Miss Me" is what the Moriarty TV screen virus thing was saying at the end of the previous season. So that's our kind of direct through line here. I think it's again a clever little mystery.
Yeah, and that could also be seen as a taunt, because it's literally saying to the detective, "I am the murderer. Hey, did you miss me?" Mm-hmm. Which is really because at first I was like, that's just a Moriarty thing, but then I was like, if you look at it like in the context of this mystery itself, like the murderer came back to put the note on after Sherlock was there, so it's a whole nother level of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It is, isn't it? Especially when you realize that there's like more than one person dressed as the bride that night. It gets even more interesting from like a logistics perspective. It's cool.
Which is something that I was gonna like mildly complain about in regards to Watson, because he abandons his post when the bride comes up behind him and goes "rawr," and then he turns and runs away in fear while he's holding a gun.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And that's what normal John would do, but from everything we've seen, this John would have just said "hello," and he would have shot her.
Bang, yeah, I know.
Like,
yeah.
So, but that's what had to happen for the story to progress in the way that it was going to progress. So, like, I go back and forth. I hate the decision. I wish they could have done something else. I don't know, a more believable way to have him run away in fear when there was just nothing that scary about the way that they did it. You know, unless it's what I said before, is that he's just not desensitized to this type of thing, and he's built up the ghost in his mind to be this soul-eating thing, so when it's finally in front of him, he just turns and runs in a panic. Maybe it's just an acting thing. Maybe if when he and Sherlock meet each other, if he had been just complete gibberish and falling on the floor because his knees wouldn't hold him anymore, you know, that kind of stuff, maybe that would have sold it a lot more. But when he gets there, he seems like mentally okay. Yeah. So maybe it's that disconnect.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's the disconnect between what the plot is telling you is happening and what you're seeing happen, which we talked about a little bit before. The show has that problem kind of semi-frequently.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back, and we are going to, I guess, set up the Moriarty stuff properly, and then there's not really much plot left after that. So, yeah, we'll be right back. Enjoy these messages. It's usually a Patreon ad, and we'll be back in a minute. Holmes speaks to Mycroft, who has somehow got hold of the card. from the body. Mycroft asks him if he misses his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, whom Holmes presumes to be dead after their encounter at the Reichenbach Falls, although his body was never recovered. Mycroft tells him that he's gotten in much deeper than he ever intended and asks if he's made a list of everything. Holmes answers yes, but refuses to hand it over until he's finished. He believes Moriarty is trying to distract and derail him. Mycroft agrees, calling Moriarty the crack in the lens, the fly in the ointment, the virus in the data. Holmes insists he must finish, and Mycroft warns him that if Moriarty has indeed risen again, he will certainly seek him out. Okay. Cool line from Mycroft here. I really like that.
Yep.
It's a cool maneuver. It's a cool maneuver to have the actual Reichenbach Falls have happened in the story. I think that's really clever. It makes me wish that the show was just this, because I'm like, man, I would have loved to see that. Yeah, but it's cool. I like it. It's a good setup. We get the list thing. We'll talk about Mycroft's, I guess, characterization probably a little bit toward the end in this episode. They completely change Mycroft's relationship to Sherlock here in a way that's interesting in both realities. But we'll talk about it. Do you have any notes on that scene, or should we get to the important stuff?
Yeah, let's get to Moriarty.
Okay. Strahd comes to visit, only to be informed that Holmes hasn't moved or eaten for 2 days. Both are confused as to why he hasn't explained his solution to the case, but Mrs. Hudson reports that Holmes is waiting for the devil. After they leave, Holmes opens a case containing a syringe of cocaine and contemplates injecting himself. As Holmes meditates, Moriarty appears before him. Moriarty implies that he was involved in the murder of Sir Eustace, but insists that Holmes doesn't really care about the crime itself. He only wants to understand how Amelia Ricoletti could have survived her apparent suicide. He taunts Holmes by implying that the case reminds him of another, before taking his gun and shooting himself in the head. Holmes is astonished when Moriarty gets up, seemingly unharmed in spite of the absence of the back of his head. As Holmes struggles with how it could possibly be done, the world begins to shake violently. There's a great line here, which I've written down, where Moriarty says, "Because it's not the fall that kills you, Sherlock. It's never the fall. It's the landing." And it's a cool line, but I have no fucking idea what it means. Like, I have no idea what this has to do with the episode. It doesn't really have anything to do with the way that Sherlock gets out of his mind palace at the... Okay, it's a cool line, but I've got no idea what it means. It was one of the lines I said at the start. I was like, there's a few really cool lines, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell this is trying to say.
I would think that it might be something about assuming something because of... So you normally, when someone falls off a high building, they fall off a cliff, they fall off a mountain or whatever, you say, oh, they definitely died because they fell. That's not true. There could be a lake under there. You know, they could have caught a branch and they're hanging off the side of the cliff, whatever. But everyone just says they fell, therefore they died, which is not at all the case. And I don't know if they were trying to go with something like that, where Moriarty is saying it's not the action, it's the final consequence that you need to be looking at. You keep looking at the physical action, but the physical thing isn't what kills you. It's the aftermath that kills you.
Right. That kind of makes sense.
I don't really know how that interpretation ties into the story.
Well, because the idea is that, like, you know, Moriarty's dead, but, you know, Sherlock is focused on the fall, like him dying. He's forgetting that it's like what happens afterwards is the important thing. I don't know. Yeah, it's where it gets a bit squinty. I'm like, I don't know how it fits in. You can see my confusion.
Yeah, because I don't think that it... Like, I think it's a beautiful line and a beautiful bit of symbolism that would have fit really well in other places, like where he's trying to solve a different mystery and he keeps focusing on the fall, and he's not focusing on the after. But in this case, the dude put a gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, so it is like if Sherlock was focusing on the gun, then that would be the fall, and the landing would be the pulling of the trigger.
Yeah.
So maybe you could think about it that way, that Sherlock was focused too much on the gun, he wasn't focused on the trigger, but even then the symbolism doesn't hold up. So that entire line may be something they just threw in there because it was so freaking cool, but they didn't have a solid way of tying it together with the overall story, and they just kind of hoped that people would roll with it.
It's kind of like, what it feels like is it feels like the actual show bleeding through a little bit, where it's like an old mistake that the actual show makes all the time, which is, as you say, like putting something cool in there and just being like, hopefully the coolness will mean that people don't want to worry about whether it makes sense or not. Like it kind of has that vibe to it, which is unfortunate, but I still think it's cool. It didn't pull me out of it too much.
Yeah, and there were some brilliant bits of dialogue in there that further characterize Moriarty. And the really interesting thing is because it's all in Sherlock's head, right? So is this actual Moriarty, or is this Moriarty as Sherlock sees him? Because you have the great bit where he walks up to the mantle and says, and they're talking about all of the times that Moriarty has been, the 6 times that Moriarty has been in Sherlock's house, and Sherlock is like, yeah, I know about all the times. And then Moriarty's like, you know about the time I slept in your bed? Sherlock is like, what now? And then he says, you know, dust is mainly comprised of skin cells. And then he picks up the dust on his fingers and then licks his fingers. And then he gives this awful grimace, and he's like, you really want your skin to be fresh. And I'm like, what? That's a brilliant line. I so love that. I am so terrified of it.
He feels scary. He feels scary in a way that the actual Moriarty couldn't necessarily, because he was so fucking like jokeified. This Moriarty feels a bit more grounded in a way that's kind of makes him scary. We talked about it a lot with the previous episode and the oh my god, what's the guy's name? The villain. Magnuson. We talked about it a lot with Magnuson, where like he feels a lot more threatening because he's a bit more composed. This is a more composed version of Moriarty. He's still a bit jokeified, but like it feels more threatening because it's less zany, I guess. Yeah, it's much more sinister.
Which is, and I don't remember how much we had talked about it before, but that is definitely a problem that I've had with villains, is that like Thanos was a great example. Like he was not, I don't think he ever yelled at any point in any of the movies. Like he was calm, collected, and in control, and the bad guy, you know. But so many villains, they are like frothing at the mouth and screaming, and like they have to have this just acting out of control and acting crazy. And I mean, Moriarty had a good bit of that, because he's like trying to talk with the barrel of a gun in his mouth. Like there's a lot of really off the wall stuff that happened in this scene, which circles back to what I was saying, is how much of that was real Moriarty and how much of that was Sherlock's version of that.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a lot in season 1 with that, like that the kind of naturalization of this particular type of villain affectation, and the way that kind of like permeated through media as a result of the Dark Knight, I guess. But yeah, this feels like they've kind of worked it out finally. And then they're going to completely shit the bed next season with Moriarty again. And it's just, it's baffling to watch them get it right here and then just completely overshoot later. But, yeah.
So it was a little bit earlier on, but when he was sitting there, like meditating, and Lestrade comes in and they're having their little conversation with Mrs. Hudson. But inside Sherlock's mind, you see he has all of these newspaper articles, and they're floating in midair, and he picks one and looks at it and picks one and looks at it. What did you think of that?
I thought the idea was cool. I thought the effects weren't great. Like the actual CG wasn't amazing, but I like the idea.
It's because it wasn't CG. They literally put them on. They literally put them on like fish line, because they were. You could look at the way that they move, because he tries to grab some of them and they kind of flutter and he has to go and get it, and you could just almost see the string attached to it.
Okay.
It would have worked so perfectly if it hadn't been in his imagination. If he had literally been sitting there and this was how he was visualizing it, was he had tied them all up with fish string.
That'd be cool.
You know, and he was picking them out and doing it, because that's how they filmed it, but they made it all be happening inside his brain. And then I'm picturing, like, why did he choose the effect of them fluttering around if it's in his brain? And then the
Why
way
not
he's
just do
looking
that?
at them and like the way he's looking at them so quickly also just doesn't really make sense, because if each one was a picture and you're trying to put together the pictures, that would have made a lot more sense. But as it was, each one was multiple paragraphs of text. So looking at it like this doesn't necessarily give you all that much, and he's just going back and forth and back and forth. So I love the idea of the visual aesthetic of reaching out and grabbing these things as an old time version of what you would do, is because it's like the exact same thing that Iron Man would do, only his is all digital.
Yeah.
You know, so that was the old version of a heads up display. You know,
Now that you're saying it, I think it would have been fucking cool as hell for him to be sitting there meditating, just have all of these things like hanging from the ceiling around him. There was such a cool visual. Yeah, it didn't even clock to me as that unusual, but now that you said that, yeah, damn, what a missed opportunity. That'd be so cool. It'd be so weird looking as well. You'd be like, what's going on with him? Yeah, I like it. Damn. Well, there you go. The Mind Palace fails us once again. What a surprise. What a surprise. They can't work out what to do with their special effects. Okay, so back in 2014, Sherlock wakes on the plane as it lands on his return from exile after killing Charles Augustus Magnuson. Mycroft, John, and Mary enter the plane, and Holmes reveals that the Victorian period was his attempt to use the Riccolotti case to solve how Jim Moriarty may have returned. Mycroft is visibly upset by this and demands to see a list of everything Sherlock has taken. Sherlock then reveals that his Mind Palace technique is fueled by drugs, which upsets and surprises John. Sherlock nevertheless insists he needs to go back. He hears Watson ask him morphine or cocaine, but John denies saying anything. This scene is cool, but also odd, and the pacing's weird. What do you think about this idea of the Mind Palace, this like kind of recontextualization?
My synopsis of it is very much what Mycroft says at the very end. He says, "I know what the Mind Palace can do. It's a memory technique. This is not something that the Mind Palace offers." And he is like distinctly tying it to the drugs and not to the Mind Palace, whereas I'm pretty sure what Sherlock is saying is like, this is a combination of both of them. I'm using this vast stored memory that I have, and I am combining it with these drugs in a way that I have tested and proven and developed so that I could run these scenarios in my brain. Mm-hmm. Whether or not that works practically, I don't know, but this like super reminds me of Abed's character, and they consistently do this with his character where they say, "Hey Abed, you're a computer, tell us what the outcome is going to be." And just because he knows the people so well, he knows the setting so well, he could tell the future in a way that Sherlock conceivably would be able to tell the past if he just had all the same data points that he needed. So I don't want to really attribute it all to being a Memory Palace thing, aside from that the Memory Palace gave him the data that he needed to work with. So attributing it all to the Mind Palace I don't think is correct, but I think the overall thing, I think it does work. And I love going back, like he gets drugged back to real life in the plane when he doesn't want to because he's not done, and he's like, "No, let me go back to sleep." And it reminds me so much of what is the Leo DiCaprio sleeping movie?
Sleeping movie? Sleeping movie? What?
They go into people's dreams.
Inception. Sleeping
Inception.
Movie. What? No one's ever described Inception as the sleeping movie. That's buck wild. What the fuck? I was like, did you mean Shutter Island? There's kind of sleeping in that. What the fuck, man? What? Inception.
Yeah, so you can see why
the sleeping
some people
film.
You can see that was my biggest takeaway from that was like people just get to sleep for that long. That was the whole movie's about people sleeping.
You're like, wow, that must really well rested. Honestly. Sorry,
but
you were
anyway,
gonna make a point about Inception, I suppose.
Yeah, so like that's what that really reminded me of, was that he is going down deeper levels. He's going down deeper levels in his Mind Palace, and it's almost like they were going in deeper levels of dreaming. Mm-hmm. And there was just such a close connection in my mind, because he gets pulled back into the waking world, but then he goes down another level in dreams, and then he thinks he wakes up, but he hasn't woken up because it's the same thing as Inception, on multiple levels. And since we're starting to get back into the real world now, I'm going to go shave real quick. Okay.
Okay, normal Darth is back. He's back. Okay. Look, I think I get that, and I also like the idea that it's not clearly like it's not representational in a way that Inception is. Like Inception is like the deeper you go, like the more layers you go, the deeper it is, but like there's rules to it. This is more just like it's just like vaguely analogous of like the deeper he goes to try and solve this mystery, the sort of further into the fantasy he goes. It's not direct one-to-one, which I think works in its favor.
And I did really like, I liked the transition, especially going back into the dream. I don't recall that him waking up was anything necessarily spectacular, but he hears Watson's voice saying something or cocaine.
It says morphine or cocaine.
Morphine or cocaine. And he's looking at regular John, but he hears Watson's voice. And then he repeats the words, only we hear Watson's voice over his face. And then it's the way that it goes back and forth before it draws you back into the past version of the story, just really worked for me. I loved how they did that transition, bringing him back into that world. And then they have this little bit where Sherlock says, I was just on an airplane. And Watson is like, what's an airplane? So some of the ways that the bleeding between the two worlds is just kind of interesting how they did it. And then they try to brush it off because it doesn't make any sense. And it's like in Inception where you don't want to acknowledge that the person is sleeping because then they'll realize they're sleeping and then it might wake them up.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of similarities once I started thinking about it.
Maybe they just saw Inception. They were like, oh, we should do that for our Christmas special. It's possible. They had 4 years. Inception came out 2010. This came out 2014. They had 4 years to plan it. Moffat's actually done that again. He did a dream episode of Doctor Who. It was a 2-parter. Maybe Moffat just really likes Inception. Anyway, 2 lines I really like. Sherlock says, I'm not an addict, I'm a user, which is exactly what addicts say. I thought that was really good. And then a line which I thought was absolutely cracking, like just a brilliant line of dialogue. Like this is Moffat writing his best dialogue. Abstinence is not immortality. Is such a great, that line is so fucking good. It is it sounds exactly like Sherlock. It's delivered really well. It's really pithy and interesting. It suits the tone of the show perfectly. And it also is like a really good argument where you're like, oh, he makes a really good point. Like, it's not like he's going to live forever if he doesn't do this. It's so clever. But it also betrays his misunderstanding of why they're worried about him doing drugs, right? Like, it does so much at once with such a simple, clean, small line. It's really great multi-purpose storytelling. I just thought it was brilliant. 10 out of 10 Sherlock. Good stuff. Really just a classic Moffat line at its best.
So in that bit on the plane, is that where they started talking about Ricoletti and then Mary started trying to help find the body?
Yeah.
Or is that the next time?
That's next time.
Okay.
But she does break into the MI6 computer on her phone to Google up the Ricoletti case.
Yeah. That was my next note, was the line, he says, what do you think of our security? And she says, I think it would be a good idea.
Yeah, it's so
good. Such a good line.
Mm-hmm. So good. We said this before, but I think when the show isn't descending into epigram and it is these quick back and forths that feel like they suit the tone really well, it's like absolutely stellar. And it feels effortless. This scene is, as I said, it's oddly paced and it's a bit clunky in places, but yeah, some of the dialogue in here is just like absolutely outstanding. Yeah, good scene.
I don't know at what point you said, and I started to say this earlier, where you were saying that the reason that you had loved this so much is because it's a mystery and the whole thing is about solving this mystery, and it's like going back to classic Sherlock. But for me, this entire episode just hits so hard because of the dialogue. Like, you could take away all the action stuff, take away all the mystery. I just want to hear these people talking like this. I could just sit and watch all these people in a room just having this dialogue when it's written this well. I would be so entertained by that. Like, I don't know what it is about this dialogue that I just adore so much, but they just did such a good job with this writing that I don't even care about the action or the plot, which is just fascinating because that's what drives the story. And I'm like, I don't care, just talk to me.
Well, but that's the clever maneuver here that happens with this aesthetic is that the reason that it's so good is that it's contained within a story that's working. Like I think that they are you can separate them. Be like, I'd like to just hear them talk, but the reason it works so well is that they complement each other brilliantly, and so like they make each other better by proximity and by being complementary. Like the dialogue is so good because of the great story it's in, and the story is great because it has awesome dialogue within it, and those punch into each other and make them, they elevate themselves. We've seen other episodes where the dialogue's been great, but then we watch the plot and we're like, the plot fucking sucks and doesn't make any sense, and so the dialogue isn't as good and we get pulled out of it more. So it's I think they're hard to pull apart in that sense.
Yeah, it's a really interesting note that dialogue hits the hardest when it is so tied to like pivotal actions in the story. It's like thinking about Aragorn when he says, "My friends, you bow to no one." Like, that means nothing if you haven't seen everything that the hobbits went through throughout those movies. But after you've seen that line goes from meaning nothing to like every grown man will cry when they watch that scene. I mean, it's 100%.
Dog, let me tell you, every time it's multi-purpose storytelling, right? That's when this dialogue is working its best, is when the line of dialogue is doing, like, it's not just someone saying something, it's telling you, like, it's giving you information, it's progressing the plot, it's giving you an insight into somebody's interiority, it's telling you about the world, it's giving you an indication of like what's gonna, like, when your dialogue is, you know, compellingly characterized, is moving the plot forward, is progressively complicating the narrative, and is also really well written and enjoyable to listen to, that's the sweet spot. And it's really hard to do. I mean, think about like even though I'm not a huge fan of like the Marvel stuff in general, if you think about the first Avengers and the second Avengers film, they're written by Joss Whedon. They're both by the same guy, but the first one feels a lot more tactile and enjoyable because the dialogue and the plot are so in lockstep. And the second one, it becomes a bit more like jokey and quippy, and they don't land as much because the plot isn't doing the right thing it needs to do. And so I think that's probably like a big part of it, is when those two things align, and when you have that multi-purpose storytelling underneath it, you just get these like scenes that like they just crackle with like tension and excitement and humor, and it's just great. Like, it works. That's what this whole episode does super well, for the most part. You know, it lands in that spot more than the base show ever really does, save maybe the first episode.
Which is really interesting because I was just watching another one of your videos and you were talking about the bit of dialogue between Hawkeye and Wanda, and he's saying the city is floating and I have a bow and arrow, and then you compared it to a bit of dialogue in a different movie and showing how like one just fits the scene so well and then the other one just feels so out of place. And I guess we're seeing that same thing here, where so much of the dialogue in normal Sherlock feels so out of place and it's just there for a joke or a one-liner, and then all of this dialogue is just it's built around the scene and for the scene.
That's 100% it. Yeah. Yes, it's built around the thing the scene is trying to do, and then everything kind of ripples outwards from that. That's why it's been so hard for me to try and convince you that like these should be mystery stories, because when they are mystery stories, everything else fires on like another level, another cylinder. Because Steve is really good at writing around mysteries. That's the thing he's really good at. And when he gets indulgent and he gets in his own head about his own characters, like we saw with that wedding episode, it just becomes like trite, and it's still fun to watch, but it's not you don't walk away being like, the end, like this is such a good episode of TV, with a few exceptions that we've covered, but like you don't have that takeaway if you're like, oh well, that was just like some pretty good dialogue and I guess they were funny. It just leaves you with a completely different appreciation for what you're watching, or it's a very different mode of, I guess, like emotional arousal, right? If it's like thrilling and exciting and trying to work out what the mystery is, but then it's also kind of funny and entertaining, there's a lot more happening versus just like, oh yeah, it's pretty funny, or like, oh, that was interesting or sounded cool. That's
And I wonder if it's because if you have a super strong story, then the dialogue is much more naturally going to be about to related to the story, whereas in the real life show, so much of it is a relationship drama. It's not at all about a mystery. Therefore, all of the dialogue is centered around the people and the interaction between the people and the relationships of the people. And so what I'm inferring here is that these writers are really good with understanding like plot structure and story and making the dialogue fit to that, but they're not good with understanding people and how people communicate. And when they're writing dialogue and it's just the people and they don't have a strong story to tie that to, then it gets really off.
Yeah, it's just like, that's a really good summation of, I guess, what's happening. The other thing to think about too is like, it's also just like not that interesting when two people are just talking to each other, like, and there's not really like anything else happening, like just at like an entertainment level. That doesn't make
That's literally what we're doing.
Yeah. Yes, and we're working through a mystery, Darth. So,
the mystery of why I think this show is good.
Yeah. There is no conspiracy about a secret final episode. This whole show has been a rug pull to understand what the fuck is wrong with Darth's brain. Yeah, but probably more what I mean is like people talking to each other on screen or in dialogue, let's say, about each other or doing character drama is a mode of television and can be interesting. But you need a plot happening for it to feel meaningful enough for you to pay attention. Like, think about the way that, Community is a show that is a comedy most of the time, that is deeply episodic in the sense that, like, you've got discrete episodes that are like pretty much non-serialized that work through an overarching plot. And all of the gimmicks and the references and the way that each episode is like an homage to something is interesting and funny, and it propels you through a plot, which allows you to learn more about the characters and their interior worlds and their relationships to each other. It's like, I've talked about it before, which is like you kind of smuggle in teaching people like about your characters through scene work, which is about plot, right? How somebody reacts to what's occurring in the plot, or behaves in relation to the plot, is how you understand their characterization. It's why when we talked last season about Tumblr users being like treating these characters like they're living people, it's why that is such a misunderstanding of like the way that writing as a craft functions. Is these characters don't exist to exist; they exist in service of the story. And so when you pull them away from that, you start to lose a bit of the like momentum and the what's what I'm looking for? Not progress. You lose, I guess, like the drive or the impetus that is going to challenge them and make them, think about who they are or make them react differently to things they wouldn't have been expecting to react to. And so I think in this context, the thing that you've identified pretty accurately is when characters in the show are talking to each other and doing their quippy, funny stuff or saying the clever things, if they're talking about something that is happening and it is pivotal to the plot or is like central to the narrative, then it becomes central to their relationship by necessity, versus it's central to their relationship and they've kind of put a plot around some of the relationship beats in order to facilitate it. And people have a really good instinctive like sense for that stuff. You intuit it more than you visually see it, I guess. It's why we all put, as academics, why we put so many words and hours and research and we spend so long talking about this stuff, is it's not hard to nail down. And that's why you develop craft and tools to diagnose this stuff, to identify it, learn how to talk about it, because it isn't as easy as like, well, that's good and that's bad. That dialogue works here and that dialogue doesn't work there. It's a very complicated kind of thing, which is the whole exercise of the show, I suppose. Yeah.
A really interesting example of what we had started that on was like two people talking isn't necessarily interesting, and I immediately jumped to thinking about the two last versions of Batman, where you have the one Batman who's talking with the Joker in the prison, and then you have the newest Batman who also has that talking in the prison scene, and they're both really interesting scenes where they're in there talking, but it's the overarching story that really makes it interesting, because he's like trying to get information out of the Joker, and then later on he's trying to get information out of the Riddler, and he's trying to figure out what is going on to stop something bigger from happening. So you're really ingrained in what's going on with their conversation, and it feels like it's this small intimate thing, but it's being driven by the overarching story, and it's just really kind of eye-opening to dig into how everything has to tie together in that, that really tight way, to both have the intimate moment but have it feel like it's still connected to everything.
And you can do little it's actually a really good example. You can do little tricks as well to kind of get around this sometimes. Like one of the best ones is like in like a thriller, or like a let's just say like a thriller, for example. Right before you have your like big crescendo, big like climactic action piece, you might often have two characters have like a personal conversation that isn't necessarily related to what's going on, as like a calm before the storm type moment. Usually like two characters who developed a relationship through the story. And they don't have to talk about stuff in the plot, but necessarily because of the structure of how those stories work, that calm before the storm moment, the reason they're having that personal conversation is because they've developed that relationship as a result of what's happened in the plot. And so even though it's not directly related, it's still informed by what's happening. That's why structure is so important to stories, is like it helps motivate placement of scenes and placement of information in a way that is like, I guess, easy to overlook. Maybe like you could watch you could watch either of those Batman scenes in isolation and be like, wow, these are really well acted, they're really well shot, they are well written, they're well paced. But when you put them in the larger context of the stories they're in, they're like pivotal to the way that both of those stories end. They happen at the same point in the plot structurally, and they both kind of have like a similar outcome, which is he thinks he's outsmarted the villain, but the villain is letting him think that, and that's kind of his mistake there is ultimately something that he pays for dearly. He gets what he needs, he gets what he wants, but at the price of something great. And it's just a fantastic, like, they're just fantastic and they work super well. But in the larger context of the story, they are so much bigger and better and more interesting. And you're right, that this episode is mostly full of scenes like that as well. Yeah. This has been an interesting diversion, because I think when we often talk about this stuff, we talk about it in the context of Tumblr users reacting to the text. It's interesting for us to approach it from us reacting to the text to a good episode. And being like,
that's the problem, is we haven't had that before, so
no,
we didn't have this opportunity.
We literally haven't. Like, we haven't had an episode this good where we've been able to be like, oh, this is why we think and feel that it's great, instead of going, oh, this is why Tumblr users think and feel it's good, but here's why they're wrong. It's just an interesting, different way to approach it. I could literally talk about that for hours, and I know we do, but I find it so interesting. Especially because you're not, like, you don't have the academic background in the craft, and so watching you piece stuff together can be really enlightening, because I'm so deep in the the academic well of things. But it's often easy to forget, like, oh yeah, there are simple ways to unpack some of this stuff that are really enlightening, that I wouldn't necessarily think of, because I'm always like, well, here are the 27 examples that we've always used in literature. Yeah. Okay, so Holmes awakens on the floor of his rooms as Watson enters. He insists that Moriarty has visited him, but Watson reminds Holmes that Moriarty is dead. Watson demands to know what drug Holmes has been using, and he admits to having injected a solution of cocaine. Watson is furious with Holmes, but they are interrupted by a boy with a telegram from Mary. After reading it, Holmes insists they go after Mary immediately, saying she may be in grave danger. I don't really have any notes on this till the end. Yeah, it's just pretty good, to be honest. The pair take a cab to a ruined church in the country, where they meet with Mary, who believes she has found the solution to the case. Mary reveals that she has been working for Mycroft. The gang descends into the crypt, where they interrupt a meeting of a secret society cloaked in purple hoods, and Holmes explains his theory of the crime. Mrs. Ricoletti faked her suicide using a body double, allowing her to kill her husband. As she was already dying of consumption, she afterwards allowed herself to be shot, so her corpse could be switched in the morgue. He reveals she was part of a secret society of suffragettes, of which Hooper and Watson's maid are also members. They tell Holmes that Sir Eustace had wooed Amelia in America but abandoned her, and that her husband also mistreated her. The women use the identity of the bride to kill men who have wronged them and create terror among the populace. Holmes deduces that the organizer of the crime was in fact Lady Carmichael, who was friends with Mrs. Ricoletti and knew about Sir Eustace's past. As the veiled bride approaches, Holmes assumes that she is Lady Carmichael. However, the bride is revealed to be Moriarty and insists that none of what is occurring is real and chides Holmes for his dramatic imagination. This is a cool solve. I like the fact that Sherlock calls attention to the drama of it all, and he's like, I really appreciate the drama, and it's blah blah blah. And then when you reflect on it, you're like, this is all happening in his head. It's very he's like complimenting himself, which is very funny to me. Yeah, what do you think about the solve?
The biggest thing that annoys me is thinking like logically, because Mary was working with them the entire time, right? Like she was part of this female gang, right? Isn't that what we're supposed to infer?
No, Mary wasn't. The line about like, you know, she's involved with so this is where I think it's confusing, because you get that line from Lestrade earlier where it's like John's like, oh yeah, she's part of like a women's movement, and then Lestrade's like for or against. I don't think the implication is that she was part of this secret society. She's just part of the normal movement, is how I read it. The way that I had interpreted it was that because every woman that we see in this episode was there in the crypt, that indicates that every woman is a part of this movement and knew what was going on, which indicated to me that Mary also knew what was going on. So she led the men there on purpose so that she could help reveal everything that was going on, because it was time for them to know. And I don't know if this is actually important to figure out, because this entire thing is happening in Sherlock's head in the first place. Mm-hmm. So there's no real reason to figure out, is this imaginary character doing it for reasons X or reasons, XYZ? I don't know. But that always just struck me, because we're used to trying to analyze their intentions. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, why is she leading them here? Was she actually working for Mycroft, or was she pretending to work for Mycroft and she actually was one of these women in the first place? And then I realized none of that matters, because this is all in Sherlock's head and blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. But so that was my only issue with the scene. I love the reveal. The only thing that I'm like equally back and forth on is that the entire thing being about the women's suffrage movement. I don't know if that is more like contrived or amazing. Like I keep going like back and forth as to whether all of these murders because like they've literally murdered 5 men. Granted, they probably deserved it, but still, yeah. They murdered 5 men, and this entire thing was about women's right to vote. And all of that was all of that was the subplot of Sherlock figuring out Moriarty's death. So, like, part of me is figuring out, like, is this a forced feminist message, or is this a good feminist message that fits really well within the story that they chose, within the vehicle that they chose to tell it in? And I'm like so on the fence about whether or not I really, really like it and think it's good, or I think it's bad. If it makes you feel any better, that's literally the conversations that are happening on Tumblr at the time. People cannot work out if this is like good representation or if this is like forced and kind of bad. I think ultimately for this show, it kind of isn't interested in whether or not, like, it's not interested in the feminist side of it. I think the writers think this is like a feminist masterpiece, but I don't think that the actual text itself is particularly interested in that. When we talk about what you means in a little bit here, it might it might illuminate what the internet thinks is going on here and the reason why this is included, and has nothing to do with the women's rights movement. Yeah. I think it's interesting that John and Sherlock talk about Sherlock's relationship to women earlier, and then this is the reveal, and it's all happening in Sherlock's head. Might be something there thematically, if not narratively, of him trying to work through this stuff.
Especially since that was the woman that Watson kept saying, you should go after her, you should date this woman, and then Sherlock sees her in a wedding dress right in front of him, so assumedly there's symbolism there with him marrying that woman, and then it turns out to be Moriarty, so there's extra symbolism there. He's not going to marry the woman that he's fit for, he's going to marry the evil villain, evil version of himself.
Well, maybe not even evil, but he is attracted to women with secrets, is sort of is an implication, or women who aren't what they seem, right? Like you have that with Adler, you have that with Janine, who turns out to kind of be very similar to him in the end. There is something interesting there about his relationship the way he views his own relationship to women. And like you said, with the reveal of it being Moriarty, the thing that Mycroft says is that, Moriarty's the fly in the ointment. He's the crack in the lens. You can very easily see how people are like, oh, they're trying to tell us that Sherlock fancied Moriarty. Because Sherlock says when Watson is asking Sherlock about his relationship to women, Sherlock says, how I feel about this, emotions are the fly in the ointment, the crack in the lens. Mycroft is like, Moriarty's the fly in the crack in the lens, he's the virus in the data. And you have this reveal at the end with the bride of Lady Carmichael, who he was supposed to be attracted to. There's this weird, parallel rhyming stuff, and people add this into the column of, reasons why, Sherlock and Moriarty, have that relationship. I don't think obviously it doesn't, that's not what they're going for, but you can see how you would get there from a lot of these pieces that are in place. I think it's probably it's pretty wrong given how this episode ends, but you can kind of see how some of these bits of data, even as we talk about it, go, what do we think this means? It's pretty easy to kind of misinterpret it if you already have that predetermined conclusion in mind. It's also very vague, so the bride gets revealed, and then we literally just cut. I think the kind of, it all goes red and Moriarty says a bunch of things, and then we just cut to the real world again. There's no sort of tying up of this as an idea really.
Yeah. So then it cuts back to the real world, and that's when they go dig up the grave, right?
Yeah. One thing before we move on though, I did just want to say the solution here to the mystery is a little bit elaborate, but it works in a way that the rest of the show struggles to pull off. I don't know why. I think it's just we get all the evidence early. You could have kind of conceivably worked it out. Yeah, it's a good mystery, good solve.
Yeah.
Sherlock awakens in a hospital and insists he must find Mrs. Ricoletti to finish the case. He insists on digging up her grave to prove that Amelia's body double is buried with her. John claims that he's doing this because he's an addict and needs a fix. He and Mary leave. Hours later, Sherlock, Mycroft, and Lestrade uncover the coffin, to which Sherlock's frustration only contains one corpse. Sherlock jumps back into the grave, insisting that she must have been buried underneath the coffin. As he digs, he hears the corpse begin to whisper, "Do not forget me," and it jumps out of the coffin and attacks him. Holmes awakens on a stony ledge above the Reichenbach. Actually, well, do you want to talk about that sequence? Anything there?
I am debating about whether or not it should have been cut or not, whether or not it actually adds enough, because the entire point of it is only to set up the scene on the falls, and that he has to do something extra special in order to fully wake up. And I don't know if that scene really gives enough. Does it matter? If that scene is gone and he goes right from the crypt to waking up on the waterfall, they have the fight on the waterfall, and then he snaps back to real life. Do you need this fake out, or is this just one of the things that these directors like to do, is they'll throw a twist in there and oh, you thought he was awake, but he wasn't really.
That's how I read it. Yeah. It's it's the twist of It's just them being like, here's a twist for the sake of having a twist, is how I certainly felt.
And how I would probably have fixed that issue is that he would had to have discovered something that would have been pivotal in his eventual fight with Moriarty. Like in the simulation of him digging up the grave, he comes to some realization or some bit of knowledge or something that is actually useful, and then that makes that scene actually useful, because as of now it's entirely pointless. And then also the way that they characterized him in that scene, like the crybaby version of him is immediately back, and it's frustrating to watch that again when you've had the mature version, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, I gotta dig up this body, I gotta dig up the body, I gotta dig up
It's annoying, eh? Yeah.
John uncharacteristically is like, no, I'm not going to help you, and then he leaves, and part of me is like, he never does that, but then it's all a dream, so it doesn't matter in the first place. But
yeah it's just like, I hadn't really thought about it, but I guess it is kind of pointless. Yeah,
I mean, we got some. I like what they did from a filmmaking perspective. Everything was shot well. It was done in a way that it is still entertaining to watch. Like, I don't fast forward through that section. I would never think about that. It's still entertaining, and it's still super creepy when he's digging around in the grave and he hears that voice singing to him again. Like, it's done really well. It makes my skin crawl, even though I know everything is fake and all that. And then we did get a beautiful bit of dialogue where John angrily says, "I'm taking Mary home." And she says, "You're doing what?" And he says, "Mary's taking me home."
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I like that relationship. It's good.
Yes.
Yeah. It's really good. Yeah. Okay, so Holmes awakens on a stony ledge above the Reichenbach Falls, where Moriarty stands over him. Moriarty informs Holmes that he's trapped in his own mind palace, a place where Moriarty cannot die because of Holmes' obsession with him. Moriarty tells him this is where their story will always end together, and the two begin to fight. Moriarty rapidly gains the upper hand and threatens to throw them both over the falls. However, he is interrupted by Watson, who draws a gun on Moriarty and forces him to kneel. Watson reveals that as a version of John, he knows when he's in a story. Moriarty insults the two, prompting Watson to kick Moriarty over the edge. He tells Holmes that he needs to wake up. Holmes decides to do so by taking a leap of faith by jumping into the falls. Okay. I like this on paper a lot. This sequence, I think, is like a really cool addition. I think I kind of wish this I was saying this earlier. This makes me wish that they had just set this show in this era. It just would have been so much better, because it's like a cool set. It looks really good. It's really interesting. It's pretty close to the illustrations in the original stories. Some of the dialogue's a bit kind of clicky, or cheesy is not the right word, but there's a quote where he says, where Moriarty's taunting him, and he's like on this tirade. He's like, I'm not your weakness. I just keep you down. You know, like it's sort of, like he kind of goes full. He goes like Joker mode without really like committing to it. I would have kind of preferred one or the other. Like it's weird. The fist fight also was just like odd. I thought the choreography of that fight was very strange.
Yeah, it was very clunky, especially compared to some of the other stuff that we've seen in the show so far. It's tended to show Sherlock as being a lot more capable in a fight, and I don't know if we're supposed to interpret that it's at nighttime. They're wearing these heavy cloaks that are soaked by the water, so it's very difficult to move. I loved the idea that, I don't remember the exact dialogue, but Moriarty says something like, "You've never beat me," and Sherlock basically says, "I'm taller than you, you're going in the water," which is so true in a fight. Like, he would have had such an actual advantage. It's hilarious. But then he proceeds to like immediately get his butt just completely
he gets
beat.
his ass handed to him. Yeah.
So that line just kind of went from being cool to, oh, you were wrong.
Yeah.
You were bad wrong.
Yeah. It's yeah. I also like that there's, Moriarty's like, it's always you and me, and when it's always you and me, I always win, and then Watson turns up. It's just cool.
Yes.
It's like, oh yeah, well, he's like, that's unfair, there's two of you. It's good.
Yeah.
I like it,
Yeah. I really love that, and they could have made it even more like endearing, because it's totally like Sam showing up and saying, "I'm always by your side, Frodo." You know, it's that kind of thing, where it hit pretty hard, but it could have hit a whole lot harder if they had, attacked it slightly differently. But I love that idea that Sherlock is successful because Watson is always there. That's supposed to be the implication, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And
right.
so it was really beautiful that they added that in there. And one note that I had that was just so interesting to look at is the scene could have come across so cheesy, but look at the practical effects that they did with the water over top of the guys, so that when Sherlock is like lying on his back on the ground and Moriarty's like punching him, and the water is pouring off Moriarty's face, and like it's hard for him to talk, but you could see it blends so well with everything. And then you had already mentioned the line from Watson, "I'm a storyteller, I know when I'm in one." Oh, I love that. I mean, it's cheesy, but it's one of those like cheesy lines that I'll have it on a T-shirt, because I love that line.
I mean, a lot of it's delivery as well. Like it's a very cheesy scene on paper, but the way that this is delivered by the actors, it doesn't feel that way. I think Moriarty's probably the cheesiest of all of them, just the way that they kind of have written him.
Yeah, and I don't think I've really given him credit so far, but the way that Watson's lines are delivered is the most natural thing in this episode. Like he just hits this dialogue so well, and I don't know, maybe if he has like practice in the theater or something, with Shakespearean stuff, but it's like he lands on everything so naturally that I said it earlier, that I would watch this just for his character, because it is just so well done.
I mean, he is just fully doing Bilbo at this point. Like this John is just him doing Bilbo. He's filming a lot of this concurrently, which is so interesting to me. That we get a line where with Moriarty defeated, John's like, "How are you going to get out of this mind palace?" He's like, I have an idea, and then Sherlock says, "Between you and me, John, I always survive a fall." John says, "But how?" And then Sherlock says, "Elementary, my dear Watson," and jumps. With different delivery, that line could have been the worst thing to happen to the show. But the way that Cumberbatch delivers it, and the framing, and the characterization of this version of Sherlock, it's on point. Like, it doesn't feel cheesy at all. It just feels like a natural part of the way that people talk. It's extremely good. I like that line a lot. It's a shame about the CG fall sequence, because that just looks bad. Doesn't even look like he's falling. It looks like he's still and the background's moving. It's unfortunate.
You watched it in much higher definition than I did.
Yeah, in 4K that does not look good. I remember I remember sequences at the time. Like Inception looks great. Lots of weird falling water in that. Sherlock was like, let's try it. Ooh, it doesn't work. That's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. You can just cut when he jumps. You don't need that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the only gripe that I had about the jump itself was that I wish he had gone over backward. If they needed to have him facing down, he could have like rolled over in midair. But the way that they had him jump, like if you watch it, his cloak billows out behind him, and he looks like a huge bat or bird or something, and it just gives a really weird feeling to it. Like, that's exactly when Batman jumps off a building. That's what you would expect to see.
Yeah.
So it just makes this weird connection in my brain, and I'm like, what am I watching again?
Yeah.
It's Sherlock the Batman? Is that what's
it is a very comic book panel frame. Yeah. But it's the same way he jumped off some bots, so mirroring and stuff. Yeah. Sherlock finally awakens on the plane, determined to defeat the returned Moriarty. He insists on returning to Baker Street, both convinced that Moriarty is actually dead, but also sure of what he's going to do next. As they leave, Mycroft collects Holmes' drug list and his notebook, which contains Redbeard, printed on the top of the page. Back in Victorian London, Watson reacts with astonishment to the story Holmes has just told him. a conjecture of how the pair might look if they lived in the future. Watson is incredulous over the idea of flying machines and telephones, and teases Holmes that he must have upped his dosage of cocaine. Holmes asks Watson if he had finished writing up the Ricoletti case and requests that he modify the ending to suggest that Holmes never solved it. Watson indicates that he will call it The Adventure of the Abominable Bride. Holmes, pleased, walks over to the window and looks out on a 21st century Baker Street. This is a cool ending. I like this ending so much. There's a quote, there's a line that's too on the nose from Sherlock where he says, "I've always known I was a man out of his time." I was like, boo, bad, too obvious. But I love the idea, and I was reading an interview with Gaddis where he was talking about this. The idea that the entire show we've been watching is actually Sherlock telling John what would happen if their adventures happened in like the 21st century is so funny to me. Like that is like this little wrinkle at the end where they're like, maybe the entire show you're watching is actually Sherlock's imagination and it's the other way around. I was like, that's clever. That's cool. I like it. What do you think about this ending? This little closing things off.
Backing up into the airplane, one thing that was really interesting was you don't see like outright love from Mycroft that much, but the way that he picks up the pieces of paper and saves them really shows like a level of care that I don't know that we see all that often from him. And my assumption is that he goes back and gets with Molly or gets with John or someone, and he's like, this is the list of drugs that Sherlock took, and they give him whatever recovery methods might be useful for that particular concoction. So that was just a little tidbit for him that probably gets overlooked, is that small action really shows a little bit about his character. And then the other Redbeard drop, which at this point has happened too often for anyone to overlook it as being significant.
It's getting pretty obvious.
And a lot of the other examples, you could just say, oh, they're just talking about stuff from their childhood. But like the camera zooming in on a name that's circled is much more obvious in a different way, And that's also kind of hinting at immediacy. Like when something comes in to fill the frame is much different than it being a passing bit of dialogue, Yeah. So it's also kind of hinting like whatever this thing is, it's getting closer,
Yeah. Getting more explicit. So I mentioned before that this episode gets a cinematic release. Like I said, there's something the BBC started doing at the time. They've kind of sort of discontinued that as a result of COVID. I want to quote from a Tumblr user that I was reading. I was reading them for a different reason, actually, for a future episode. But I came across this quote about them going to see The Abominable Bride in cinema. And it is the most like... So I'm going to read you this, and then I'm going to get your thoughts on it, and then I'm going to tell you what the words you meant and why that's there. Or in theory, what the internet thinks is happening there. So this is from a Tumblr user, Archipelago Chea. I don't know how you fucking say that. These usernames are crazy. Okay, quote. Going to see TAB, The Abominable Bride, in the cinema was fun, but I think the most profound effect it had on me was seeing, thanks to the audience reaction, the show that most casual viewers see. A quirky, witty detective show with a dark sense of humor and cases that are fun and clever if you don't think about them too much. And that's it. Relationships are unimportant. Character development non-existent. There's no arc. Dramatic plot points exist purely to be exciting and or amusing, and are easily dismissed or outright forgotten. It's an astoundingly different show. To the extent that I wonder if that's even the intended surface at all, or if Moffat and Gaddis have been face-palming for 6 years. Before this, I had no idea it was even possible to see two such massively different shows while looking at the exact same thing. I'm honestly floored. End quote. Now, I don't need to explain the irony to you of this Tumblr user perfectly explaining the show as it is, the show that exists, which is, quote, a quirky, witty detective show with a dark sense of humor and cases that are fun and clever if you don't think about them too much. And that's it. Relationships are unimportant. Character development is non-existent. There's no arc. Dramatic plot points exist purely to be exciting and or amusing, and are easily dismissed or outright forgotten. End quote. That's basically how you described the show to me when we started. Like, that's the show that is here. And this person's like, man, these fucking sheep in the cinema, like, that's what they see. They don't know that this is this crazy, like, it's so interesting to me that, like, they're not saying this to be like, huh, these people don't understand. They're literally being like, I don't understand how people could think this, because it's so clever and involving and complicated. How could you possibly think it's this basic thing? You know, it's really interesting to me that users are sort of identifying that correctly, but assuming that it's the incorrect identification of the kind of thing that they're consuming. I think that's fascinating that they describe what the show turns out to have always been. One thing that I would like to pull out of that, before I get your kind of take on that, is obviously that in-group, out-group mechanism is returned, where it's them, the normal casual viewers, and then us, the people that know the truth. That's kind of here as well, which we'll talk a lot about next season, in the lead up to the finale. Yeah, what do you think about that? That little kind of that take on this special.
Well, that's fascinating, but you see that in a lot of those groups where it's a cult might be too strong of a word, but like when a group of people like wholeheartedly believes this one particular thing, you will sometimes, and it's happened often enough that you could say pretty frequently, hear them describe exactly what they are or what they do, but they'll describe it in the opposite way as what everyone else thinks. Mm-hmm. Like you'll see, like, you know, QAnon people might say XYZ, but they're really describing themselves and they just can't see it. Yes. They're describing what they think the enemy is, but they're describing themselves. And that's just kind of what that description was, you know, they can't see that they're describing yourselves, which a lot of the time you'll hear people say that the biggest blank spot that you have is you know, evaluating yourself. Mm-hmm. So I guess that tracks logically.
Yeah. Well, that's 100% it. I also just think it's really interesting that they, as you say, like they can identify like what the thing is. They can identify what this text is doing, and then go, but actually, I'm still going to hold on to my the sphere that I'm operating in. I'm gonna hold to my predetermined beliefs and assumptions, and that's just that interesting. We talked about it before. When I mentioned QAnon, you know, throughout, and these kind of big tent conspiracies is like, these people are really good at believing two things at once, which is like two contradictory things, which is seeing what the show really is and then believing an alternative interpretation that they have sort of bedded themselves down into further and further. What's interesting about this special, though, from a historical perspective, based on the reading I've done the last kind of 3 or 4 weeks, is because it isn't happening in the show, it is a lot freer to be interpreted as like a metaphor or an analog or hinting at what's to come. And it's the first time reading through these theories that I'm like, oh, some of these actually kind of hold water. They're not that complicated, though. Like, they're not as complicated as, you know, the John Locke conspiracy. They're just good foreshadowing. So you asked me before, why are they painting you on the walls? I'm going to try and read you this person's explanation of what's going on while avoiding spoilers for the end of the show. So this is from Cheese and Onion Crisps on Reddit. So bear with me, this is going to be kind of tricky. Okay, so the quote. First of all, pretty much every woman in the episode, aside from Mrs. Hudson, is hiding something. Molly is disguising herself as a man, Mary is working for Mycroft, and everyone else is secretly in the suffragettes. The theme of women and secrets are pretty entwined in this episode. Then there's Amelia herself, who dresses as a ghost and does even come back from the dead, all the while singing, "Do not forget me, do not forget me." So we're looking for a secret woman in Sherlock's life whom he has forgotten and whom he associates with death and singing. So, redacted, basically. The women in TAB are actually representations of redacted. Remember, the Abominable Bride is set just seconds before Sherlock receives the "Did you miss me?" message. The episode tells us that Sherlock thinks that the message is from Moriarty, and maybe he does. But we frequently see Sherlock make deductions he doesn't quite understand. It's not totally impossible that he somehow found the link between Moriarty's message and redacted. Not sure how he would have done, but if anyone could do it, it would have been Sherlock Holmes. Don't believe me? Here are more hints hidden throughout the episode. Ooh, I don't know how to do this without spoiling it. Okay, so if I don't say that, I'm going to skip that one. In the graveyard scene, the words beloved something appear on Amelia's grave. While waiting for the ghost to attack, John starts a conversation about Sherlock's emotions and how he represses them. We later learn that he represses redacted. Sherlock describes the suffragettes as ignored, patronized, and disregarded. We learn that redacted feels the same way about Sherlock. When Mrs. Hudson is complaining about how barely mentioned she is in John's stories, Sherlock says, "Don't feel singled out, Mrs. Hudson. I'm hardly in the dog one." John and the audience assume he's talking about the Hounds of Baskerville, but that makes no sense. Sherlock is the main character in that. It's very unlikely that John somehow managed to omit him. However, there was a mystery that Sherlock played a fairly small part in, the disappearance of blank, whom Sherlock remembers as a dog. The kid from the Sign of Three is in this episode despite being a fairly minor character. This could be because Sherlock associates redacted with children. Redbeard in his dog redacted is mentioned in Sherlock's dream. Sherlock hears the sound of a dog barking and mutters redacted. This is really hard to do. But that's the evidence, right? Like, you can kind of see. It's physically painful to do, by the way.
I want to make a rap out of that. It's just redacted.
The cadence was bizarre. Because I was reading it and I'm like, I can't say that. So I was trying to like remix the sentences as I was going through. But you can kind of see how, like, for me, like, this is like obviously what's happening to a certain extent. Is like this. I don't think that they are. This isn't like a metaphor or like a. It's not like symbolism or it's not like a secret meaning. It's just themes they're introducing that are going to like become important later. Like, this is just like a story that's being told and they're like, yeah, like this is something that is at the heart of who Sherlock is as a person. These ideas of like, you know, his ability to be vulnerable with people and his complicated relationship to women. This is just like exploring those, and it's his subconscious, so it makes sense that this stuff is all kind of bubbling to the surface. But I don't think that it's this like big tentpole conspiracy of like, I don't think it's Moffat and Gaddis being like, oh yeah, like look at all these secrets. It's like, no, like when you find out, you know, the thing I wasn't saying, it kind of, you go like, oh yeah, that makes sense. This has been kind of banging around his head for a while. You know, it kind of comes out in different ways because it's like trauma that he hasn't processed. Yeah. And so this is going to be really hard to do. So you is a sound that's part of redacted. So that's yeah. Does that
clear things up?
So if anyone who's watched the show before, they're like, oh yeah. For anyone listening to this, I sound like a raving lunatic. Because people don't know, they're like, what the fuck is Dave talking about? You'll find come back and listen to this clip after we finish the show.
So this is like if we're reviewing episode 1 with someone who knows nothing about Star Wars, and we're like, yeah, Anakin turns into redacted, and then Senator Palpatine, he's actually redacted.
Yeah,
and then
you know, it's actually foreshadowing Anakin's fall to redacted. And you'll see the double symbolism of Obi-Wan wearing white clothes and Anakin wearing dark leathers because redacted. But you see the pretty obvious connection here, right?
Yeah, and I've said this so many times that I would be really curious if the writers did any of that on purpose, or if all of this was just people finding meaning where there was none. Mm-hmm. That does seem like a lot of coincidences that can all tie together to point to a certain redacted. Yeah. But is it statistically impossible for those coincidences to all happen? No, that could have all they could have all been coincidences. That's possible. But I would love to give the writers the credit of having done all of that on purpose. I think we just do that too much, and most writers just luck into stuff.
Listen, let me tell you. There's stuff in my books that people are like, oh my god, that's so clever, and I'm like, okay, well that was an accident. And there's other stuff where I'm like, oh, I spent so much time laboring over making this thing work, and it's going to be great. People are going to work out what's going on. You know, it's this really clever thing, and then people read it and they just like completely miss it. And you're like, what the fuck? So yeah, I think in this case, the thing that makes me think that this is sort of, you know, I don't necessarily, like I said, I don't think this is a secret that they like buried here. I think this is like, the episode is thematically about stuff they're going to explore next season. Like very obviously they explore it next season. And they're just like dropping hints about like that being a focus for the show. As you say, whether or not the specific evidence and the specific this, that, and the fifth thing, whether those are intentional or not, this episode is certainly about Sherlock's relationship to women and women's relationship to, I guess, like secrets and patriarchal structures, I guess. Like that's explicit in the text. And so it kind of like sets us up nicely thematically for next season. But yeah, that was all I had for this episode.
Yeah, my very last note was, OMG, that's my favorite episode ever. I loved it.
I've simply written at the end of it. I've got that quote around like, I've always known I was a man out of his time, and then I've written a bunch of crap being like, this is the worst fucking line ever written. And then I've written, okay, this last moment is clever as hell, and this episode's actually brilliant. So yeah, clearly I think that last transition just got me, where it's the look out onto 21st century. I was like, damn, that's cool.
Yeah. So I'm curious what they, because maybe it's cheesy, but I loved that line, especially in combination with that transition. So what could they have done differently with that line to have made you not hate it so much?
I think the show would have had to have been good before this. Like, is the short answer. I think if the show had been good, and this wasn't the only good episode that I've had a really great time with, and here's why, right? I'll try and explain. First of all, that was a joke, but I can also explain what I mean, which is, I think that the show so often acknowledges the source material and then claims to be smarter than it, or that it needs to be fixed, that a line like this kind of feels condescending. Like, I've always known as a man out of his time because the show isn't set in, you know, the Victorian era, because the conceit of the show is a modern Sherlock Holmes. But if the conceit of the show is a modern Sherlock Holmes, why did you throw out so much of the architecture of the original stories that you clearly understand how to use properly because it's in this episode? And so it's kind of like saying, well, thank God we didn't make this episode. Thank God we didn't set it in this era. That'd be fucking lame. Like, it has that kind of... I don't know, it feels textually condescending to me in a way that is not the writers doing that on purpose, but is the way that this kind of sits for me structurally. It's probably why it feels so cheesy and brought me out of it, I guess. It's because like it immediately was like, you don't really get to say that if you set your show in a different time period and deliberately piss on the legacy of the thing that you're basing it off of. I guess.
You're either going to like this or hate this. So
oh, God.
You dislike the line completely out of the context of that scene, out of the context of this episode. You hate the line because of other episodes and how they tie in to this.
Well, yeah, because this scene is about how the other episodes tie into this. Like, this scene is about, like, that's what this conversation is about, you know. Watson is talking about the flying cars and the machines and teasing Holmes about, like, you know, Holmes about this potential future. The show is explicitly being like, hey, think about this. Like, it's because of the other apparatus that isn't explicitly in this text, but also the text is telling me to think about those things by being like, hey, what if all of the things that were happening in the main show were actually just like imaginations of here? So it's calling my attention to that, which is why I think about it, rather than an example of, let's say, the fat scene with Mycroft. That's me criticizing that scene for paratextual reasons that one could argue are, like, not in the text. You could be like, well, the text isn't trying to do that. And so you could say that's an invalid reading. I'm bringing, like, extra textual material in. Yes, I'm criticizing it for stuff that isn't happening in this episode, but also the show's fucking telling me to think about that. By literally pointing it out and then having a line like this, it's telling me, hey, think about the fact that, like, our Sherlock is set in the future. Wouldn't it be crazy if, blah blah blah. So that's why I was thinking about that stuff. I imagine.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it just sat funny with me, and it's only as we passed it out now that I've kind of worked through that. That being said, it's still a cool line. Like, I still like, again, the dialogue is never the issue. It's always where it fits in, I think. Yeah. Something to think about, though, because I think a lot of the times in text, we have criticisms of it that aren't necessarily about the thing that's happening or aren't, in reaction to the text, right? You think about people disliking, say, like The Force Awakens because, it had, Rey was Mary Sue or whatever. Has very little to do with the story that is being told. You're bringing in like these extra textual elements and criticizing it. I think the difference is like if Star Wars had pointed out like, hey, think about the fact that like Rey can do everything, which they kind of do in the last one, because then they're like, don't you think it's weird that she's really good at the Force? That's when you start to think about it. I think it's always tricky. You want to like massage these things in, but calling attention to stuff can have that unfortunate consequence of like, it made me think about how frustrating I find a lot of the things they do in the modern context. Like it literally, like my brain went to like, ugh, it just reminded me of all the reasons why I don't like the way that they use their setting and the missed opportunities they have.
So overall summation was there were a couple negative points, but for the most part, absolute best episode so far.
By
a
episode.
Wide margin.
Yeah, huge margin. It makes me mad that they didn't just make this show, because damn, that would be good. It's what a great sweet taste before we dive into the absolute chaos that is season 4. What a nice little holiday. For reference, because these will come out in the same cadence as everything else. We took like 4 weeks off between and then we covered this. And I did that very deliberately because I knew we'd be watching this for the first time, so I knew I'd need more time for research. But also, I think it was a good opportunity to let the previous season kind of settle. And then coming to this, I was like, man, this is like, I was primed to have a great time, and I did. And I'm very worried about next season. Because I remember it so vividly, particularly episode 1. Because episode 2 fucking rips. Like, I really like episode 2. It's not a good story. It's told really poorly. It's awkward and bad. But I remember episode 1 of season 4 being almost unwatchable. So I'm thrilled to see what I think of it this time through this historical lens.
So you're thrilled to spend the next 15 hours watching it and preparing to talk about it.
Yeah. I'm really keen to spend my the next kind of fortnight working through it in agonizing detail. I'm probably gonna have to lean on the historical context a lot, otherwise I'm gonna lose my fucking mind. But I am very.
It was interesting talking about all of the stuff with him being out of his time and how you were so keen on the idea of seeing past Sherlock and not current Sherlock. And I would love to see an entire series with those characters played by those actors in that that context. But I also would love to see Sherlock, not necessarily now, but like in maybe like 2050, something like that. Like, it's the same thing with like Spider-Man 2049 or whatever that the future version of Spider-Man, and then same thing with like Batman Beyond. Like, what would these characters be like when the future is so advanced technologically, and how would Sherlock fit into that world? Because everything that we see here is just barely on the cusp of technology. It's like they're using flip phones and stuff, like it is nowhere near what Iron Man would be dealing with. And how would Sherlock fit into that world? I would adore to see that version of the character written by competent writers.
It's funny you would say that. I'm just going to screen share something really quickly. Give me 2 seconds. If I go a tab. Let me know if you can hear this. Share. See that?
Yeah.
No, there's no sound yet. Hang on.
Wow. Wait a minute.
They
Dude,
bring him back
Blast
to
from the
life
Past.
in the 22nd century.
I've seen this.
Have you?
Apparently, because I recognize the mustache dude.
It's incredible.
Dude, my mind is blown right now. Like,
Yeah.
it was like my subconscious was reminding me, hey, you've actually seen this in the past.
It's a catchy tune as well. Fucking love that shit.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I want to see that in live action.
Yeah, so that exists and it's just out and about in the world. Yeah. Sherlock Holmes in the 22nd century. What an absolute ripper of a cartoon. It's so fucking, it's bizarre. I think they saw Batman Beyond and they were like, we could do that, but with Sherlock, no, you can't. You can't do that. You're not Paul Dini. Like, you don't got it like that, guys. What a fascinating artifact. Yeah. Most of that's like just on YouTube for free as well, so you should definitely check it out.
Huh. Cool.
Yeah. There you go. Well, maybe Darth's wish will be fulfilled next season. Maybe we'll like get a cool future. We don't get a cool future episode. I'm sorry. Okay, so next season we'll be back. Probably we'll take a little bit of break here on the feed, like probably about a month between episodes, and then we'll be covering season 4, episode 1, the 6 Thatches. Those are probably going to somehow be longer episodes next season because we'll have a bit more to talk about with the approaching finale. So we'll have 3 episodes covering the last 3 episodes, and then we'll have our like kind of penultimate episode where we're going to cover the conspiracy about the final secret episode, and then probably wrap up our thoughts in general on the show. And then that's the podcast. So we're kind of nearing the nitty gritty side of things, which is very exciting. So if you want to support us, consider heading to patreon.com/zeroindent. I spend a lot of time researching this stuff, and that money basically helps buy back time from other stuff that I need to do. So you can support us there. You can find Darth on YouTube at Darth_D. The easiest thing to do is just search that in the YouTube thingy and it'll come up. We do all kinds of other interesting stuff. By the time this comes out, because this will come out in like 2.5 months after we record this, I should have... Will it be out yet? My 3rd novel might be out, or it might not. But you can find my novels at maynardtrick.com. Is there anything you want to plug, Darth? Any projects you have coming up? Anything that you've released recently?
Yeah, it's so fascinating as you were just trying to think about, like, if this episode is getting released in X number of months, then what am I working on now that will be released in X number of months?
Yeah.
And because it's like what I said I was working on last episode, which we filmed a month ago, I just released last week. So I can't say I'm still working on it. But this episode won't be released for my channel for many months. So anything I plug now will have been released months ago.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to say that I'm working on stuff and time is wibbly wobbly.
Yeah. Due to the way that phenomenological time passes, this happened. We recorded this before this came out. What's even more confusing, which I appreciate, so a friend of mine texted me because he was listening to, I think it was like, he was listening to like the first episode in season 2. And he was like, when did you record this? And I had to like literally go back on my calendar. I was like, I don't know, like March or April or something. And he was like, so you recorded this before this stuff happened, and you were talking about this? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, what? And I was like, yeah. And he was like, but he was like, but it sounded like you referenced something that happened to us after that. I was like, well, you're just imagining things, man. Like, you just in your own head about some shit that, like, I wasn't alluding to anything. I was just, wasn't really there, which I thought was funny because that's the mode of the Tumblr users who are like inventing
that's
stuff.
what I was about to say.
Yeah. So I was like, that's good. Look, yeah, we'll be back for season 4, our final season. I'm super keen to get into it. I think it's probably, this is where like sort of all of the mode of this show and the process is really going to pay off big time. We're going to see all kinds of big swings for theories. We're going to see, a lot of misses with those theories. And then we're probably going to kind of, with our finale, see the decline and the sobering up of the fandom around Sherlock, kind of starting to realize, like, man, this thing isn't what we thought it was, and it really did change the way a lot of people consumed content. And this is really like a marker in the way that people engage with fandom as well, right? The next season comes out in 2017. And that's really the end of the era of the Tumblr fandom to a certain extent. This breaks the back of, the kind of Super Hulock, era of Tumblr. This the way this show ends really does ruin a lot of people. No, I shouldn't say ruin, but it snaps people back into reality, and they start to gain a bit more media literacy, and they start to maybe see things as they are. Other users double down and drift further from reality, and we'll kind of talk about that as well. But yeah, I'm excited to get into it. It is also the season of television that revealed, tangentially at the same time, Stephen Moffat's Doctor Who to be very not good at all. And that's a really interesting parallel that we'll talk about too, and sort of what that all means for like British television in general, and how they've never really fully recovered from hanging their hopes on Moffat and his TV shows, and I guess some of the fallout of that. So yeah, we've got lots to talk about next season. Thanks so much for watching or listening. If you watch this on like a podcast catcher, consider giving us a rating or a review. If you're on YouTube, feel free to give us a like and a comment. Do all that stuff you guys know how to do. Otherwise, we will see you very soon for next season, our final season. So catch you guys then. And whatever ridiculous visual gag Darth brings to the table. Oh dear.
As you were talking, one thing that I thought could be interesting, and I don't know if it's right for this, but is talking about why it seems like so many show endings or trilogy movie endings just suck and like ruin it for half the fandom. Mm-hmm. And I'd be curious to investigate why that is the case.
That would be interesting.
But I don't know if that really ties into what we're doing here or if that's its own thing.
I was thinking about this last night. We could tie that into the Rian Johnson show idea. And what we could do is we could start with watching. So this was my idea for that show. We would watch Force Awakens, and then we would watch every Rian Johnson film in chronological order up to The Last Jedi, and then we would watch Rise of Skywalker. And then we could use that to frame like talking about endings, I guess. That could be a really interesting maneuver, potentially.
Alrighty then.
That's sort of what I was thinking. I was like, because I'm going to start the Daredevil show with Pat, and then as that wraps up, that's probably like the next big thing that I want to tackle. Because that won't be that long. Ryan doesn't have that many films, and then we can think about the Community idea, because it's going to be a really long show if we do that.
Yeah. There's different ways that I would discuss doing the Ryan show, because either the show is about Ryan and trying to figure out if he's a good director or not.
Yep.
Or the show is about episode 8 and is it a good movie, and is it a good Star Wars movie or not? And I think that those are two entirely different topics.
That's interesting. But really, because to me they're so interrelated. Because so I do not think there is any reason to take the work that he did in Brick to try to prove why what in episode 8 is good. What in episode 8 should stand on its own. Yeah, at least within this. That's not how text works, though, right? Like the thing. Okay, perhaps the thing that's interesting to me is the thing you just said before, which is like, is it a good film or is it a good Star Wars film? And understanding the maneuvers that a creative storyteller like Rian Johnson, like someone who works at a craft, understanding the typical maneuvers they practice and the types of stories they're interested in telling, will hopefully illuminate the divide between like what he thinks a good film is and what a Star Wars film kind of needs to be or should be, or a good Star Wars film looks like. Because that to me is where the tension is, right? Like we've been talking a lot in this show about Sherlock, and I've been referencing a lot of Moffat's kind of tendencies, and they've illuminated a lot of when things are working or things aren't. Like, I know what you mean in the sense that like they're two different topics, but they're topics that you can talk about concurrently to get to like the the outcome. Maybe to your point, then you start by watching The Last Jedi, and then you do the body of work up to The Last Jedi again, and so the whole thing is contextualized against it. I don't know. Like there's some way that you can structure that.
I guess really what I'm thinking about is like from the I can't remember the super powered kid movie with the time traveling Bruce Willis.
What? Looper?
Good gracious. Looper.
You had the strangest way of describing it. I was like, the what? You know, the way that you describe that is, you know, the time travel film with Joseph Gordon-Levitt goes back in time to hunt himself, and people are like, oh, Looper. You're like, no, the one with Bruce Willis and there's a superpowered kid.
Which is really interesting. Like the stuff that I take away from the movie, like that movie, what I remember the most is the kid with the superpowers. Mm-hmm. Like that is immediately where my brain goes, and only after I've been thinking about it for a few minutes do I remember that time travel was at all involved in that movie whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Which is just really interesting. But anyway, so the point of it was like I could dig through that movie and find out so many good things that would leave me coming away saying, wow, this director is amazing. But then that paints my idea of episode 8, and then I could give it way more leeway for the stuff that I perceive to be wrong. Whereas right now, for the most part, I'm going into most movies not knowing much or anything about the creative team. Like even for shows that I love, like for Community, like I don't look at anything. There's apparently like drama with Pierce. I have never researched anything about it because I don't want to know. Like I want to keep those worlds separate.
That's
unless I'm like trying to analyze something for, like work, which this is, more work than entertainment. Mm-hmm. But when it's stuff that's like pure entertainment, I'm not looking at behind the scenes stuff rarely, if ever. Like Lord of the Rings was probably the most I've ever done, and that was because it was all part of the box set and it was just it was organized so beautifully.
There was also so much of it too.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess the exercise, so like probably similar to the Sherlock exercise, the exercise of examining that film is I think that from a craft perspective, working through the lens of craft toward understanding what that film is attempting to do versus what it actually does is the thing that I think is really interesting about Johnson's career. Knowing a bit about mostly just having seen the films he's made. Like I don't know a lot about the guy himself or what he believes, but having seen a lot of his work, there's something really interesting about the product that ends up being The Last Jedi, in both the fact that it's a Star Wars film and then also the fact that it's like a Johnson film. And there are things about it that you can look at and be like, in isolation, that was probably a good decision, but in the broader picture of this being a Star Wars film and in this trilogy and with these characters, it doesn't work. And so I think that would, if we end up doing that show, that's the work of that show, right? Is passing the craft of the filmmaking and like story as craft, and then also going, yeah, but like, and this is where like you and Raya are like invaluable in that space. Is like, yeah, but like, what is Star Wars doing, and how does it work, and what does it do when it's working well, and what does it do when it's working poorly? And those are interesting things that intermesh, and you can kind of try and pull them apart and be like, what is happening here? That's where I think the interesting conversations would come from.
Yeah, I should think, and I think you had said this, that reviewing episode 8 first, and maybe only doing like a broad strokes, like hour-long synopsis of like really broad strokes why we think the movie does not work, then having you take us through all of Johnson's previous work and showing all of the stuff that we're probably not seeing, because I mean I know you rave about him, so there's got to be some some really good stuff there. And then going back and looking at episode 8 within that newly framed context, to see if the original points that we had, and we could maybe even make like a little map, kind of like Rai took us through with the female protagonist thing, and make a map of what is a good Star Wars movie, and then we kind of map that out and show all the ways that we think episode 8 doesn't fit that. That's
a really good idea. To be clear, there's things about Johnson that I really dislike from a craft perspective, and I think that's also going to be fascinating, because there are things I know he does that you and Rai both like. So I think that's also going to be really cool. I love the idea of a map, of being like, like that first, yeah, it's like, well, why doesn't it work? And then what is a Star Wars film? And then we can assess it at the end and be like, what does it make this piece of media? Like at the end of the day, what is The Last Jedi? How is it working? How isn't it working? Yeah, it could be really interesting.
Yeah. And I don't know how to really delve into that whole thing without going deep into J.J. Abrams too, because like I've done hours of analysis of how I think that he is the reason the entire sequel trilogy failed. Because I mean everything Johnson did was built off of J.J. and that's where all the problems started. So
yeah, interesting. Well, I think that's probably like the context that I'm hoping you and Rye can bring to the table, because it's certainly not like, I know a lot about Star Wars because I've spent too much time talking about it, but it's not a thing I'm not a fan of it necessarily. So that's where I think it's like the tension between Johnson picking up what was done and then trying to do something with it, and whether or not that doing something with it was the thing that should have happened. Because you get to the Rise of Skywalker and like they throw out Trevorrow's script and then they give the film to Abrams, who just like completely ignores everything that Johnson was trying to do. Whether or not what Johnson was trying to do made sense, it is made worse by the fact that it's ignored in the following film. Which is interesting because Johnson doesn't typically do sequels, and so like there's a lot happening there. Yeah, I think that could be a really interesting exercise. I have to think a bit more, as you say, like structurally, what would that show look like? But similar to the Sherlock thing, there'll be a lot of pre-production work that I'll have to start thinking about, like how is this going to function? Like what is the yeah.
And then if Rye were to be involved, figuring out how we could do this on a schedule that he's able to maintain.
Well, he's pretty free these days, so we probably just have to time it right. And that probably wouldn't be till next year anyway. Just looking at the calendar, right? Because like we'll be in November by the time we finish Sherlock, earliest, maybe like start of December. So we've got plenty of time to start that pre-production process. Yeah. Well, at some point I'll throw together like a shared doc and we can start just jotting down like just brainstorm ideas and see what we kind of think of structure. Because the other thing I'm thinking about is like there are certain Johnson films where it would be interesting to get certain guests on as well. In addition, like I know for a fact that like Mitchie, who's one of the co-hosts of A Method to the Madness, he really eloquently pointed out a lot of the problems with Brick. Whereas when me and Pat and B covered Brick on Arthuratus, it was like we were able to really clearly articulate like, well, what's working here and what's formally happening. And so it'd be cool to bring in people that we know are positioned interestingly around those films. Is the other thing that I probably think could be cool.
Cool. All right.
Sounds like the start of a plan. Oh God, I forgot about Looper. That's not a very good film.